Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Oh, I've got quite the fun story for you today. It builds into one of the most tense and creepy ending sequences I've ever heard in a story on this show. This story is titled, I Met Her in the Rain, and it was sent to me by an anonymous sender. It's about a man who takes care of vacant homes along the coast, but a long rain brings something with it that seeps into his heart and leaves him changed forever. I'm Darkness Prevails, and this is Tales from the Break Room. Get more stories like this without ads and more over at Eerie.fm by becoming a premium member. Help us keep our horror alive. Thank you. I took that job because my dad said I would never keep it. That isn't the whole reason, but it's most of it. I was 24 years old. I had started a 2-year HVAC program at Clark College when I was 20, and I quit 8 weeks in. There was this warehouse job before that, and a tire shop job before that, and my dad kept a running total in his head. He's a diesel mechanic in Vancouver, Washington, 31 years at the same shop. He's never once in his life called in sick. At least, that's what he says. When I told him I was moving out to the coast in May to clean vacation rentals, he said, "Okay, good." Then he said he'd see me in August. He wasn't being mean about it. He was teasing. So I stayed past August. Then I stayed past September. By the next couple months, the summer crew broke up, and Sherry Voss, who owned the outfit I'd been cleaning for, asked if I wanted to move over to off-season maintenance, which was $19 an hour plus mileage instead of $17 and no mileage. I said yes before she finished the sentence. Kilchis Bay is a town of about 600 people on the North Oregon coast. There's a market and a gas station that closes at 7, and a church and a school, as well as a bar I went to twice. I rented a room over a garage from a woman named Gail for $450 a month. The room had its own outside stairs and a hot plate and a bathroom with a shower, but I did have to stand in the shower sideways to fit properly. The job was houses. 9 miles north of the town, there's a development called Sea Ridge that somebody put up in 2006 or 2007. 22 houses on 4 streets, all built by the same outfit off of 3 floor plans. Scattered around the outside of that were the older places, on Cormorant Lane and up Bell Road, houses from the 60s and 70s that people had bought and updated and rented out. Sherry managed 31 of them on a weekly check, and another 12 on a quarterly, and every single one of them sat empty from the second week of October to spring break, except for the odd Thanksgiving or New Year's rental. What I did was keep them from rotting, basically. That's really what it was. A house on the Oregon coast that nobody lives in for 5 months will try to eat itself. So I'd let myself in with the lockbox code, and I'd run every faucet for about 30 seconds, because if the water sitting in the P-traps under the sinks evaporates, then sewer gas comes up through the drain, and it can make the whole house smell like a septic tank by March. I'd flush every toilet for the same reason. I'd check the thermostat was holding at 55. I'd go down on my hands and knees at the crawlspace hatch with a flashlight and look for standing water, and I'd look at the ceilings for stains, as well as empty the dehumidifiers. The dehumidifiers really were the whole job. Sherry had bought a pile of the same model, a white one with a plastic tank in the front that pulls out like a drawer. In a normal winter, you'd empty it every few days. Then I'd fill out a sheet on the clipboard, 1 line per house, and read the whole thing off to Sherry on the phone at the end of the day, so she would have it for her records. As a bonus, Sherry did everything on paper because she was 61 and did not know how to use apps. Manny Ocampo had the older houses, and I had Sea Ridge. Manny was 50-something and quiet. He had a granddaughter he talked about constantly whenever we were near each other. But the guy up and quit on the 19th of December because his daughter in Salem needed some help, and Sherry, I guess, never decided to replace him. So from December on, I had all of it. 31 houses. The 12 quarterly ones just sat in the back of the binder and I never got to them. And Sherry said, "Don't worry about it. Get to them when you get to them." If it had been a normal job, I'd have been home every night. But then the rain really started in January. Rain on the coast in winter isn't news. It can rain from Halloween to damn near Easter, and everybody's used to it. Nobody really brings it up, not in a serious way. What made this one different, though, was that it literally didn't stop. It never let up overnight, and it never gave you an hour in the afternoon to get a load of stuff out to the truck, not without it and your collar getting soaked. It came in one weekend, and it was still coming down 19 days later when I left. By about 3 or 4 days in, the marsh had come up over Highway 101 at the low spot, about 2 miles north of town. At high tide, there was 8 or 10 inches of brown water across both lanes, with cattails standing up in it. So the local government had to put out sawhorses, and the only other route from Kilchis Bay to Sea Ridge was the Ridge Road, which is gravel and climbs up over the ridge in a lot of tight, blind turns. It takes 50 minutes, if you don't meet a log truck. At the same time, my workload roughly tripled. Every crawl space had water in it. Every dehumidifier tank was full, and when they're full, they shut themselves off and do nothing. So if I let a house go too long, I'd come back to a shut-off machine, and mold blooming on the north wall of the master bedroom. Sherry was calling me twice a day by then. The owners were calling her from Phoenix and Boise, wanting to know if their houses were okay. And she'd tell them, "Danny's out there right now." And Danny was out there. So, on that day when the marsh flooded, I had an idea, one that kept me from having to drive back. The idea came to me when I was completely exhausted. I finished down at Sea Ridge Drive around 9 at night, and I sat in my truck in the driveway, visualizing that 50-minute drive up gravel in the dark with all that rain. So I just walked back inside the house I'd been working on. I slept on top of the comforter with my jacket over me and my boots by the door. In the morning, I pulled the comforter straight, wiped down the counter, took my trash out with me in the truck. Nobody was the wiser. Then I did it the next night at a different house, and the night after that. Now, don't get the wrong idea. This was a firing level offense. Sherry trusted me with 43 sets of lockbox codes. If an owner had driven up unannounced and found some kid asleep in their bed, that's the company and her insurance and her whole business on the line. I told myself the road was closed, which was mostly true at high tide, and I told myself I was saving the owner's money and mileage, which was also true. But I never told Sherry, or even my dad, that I was doing that. By then, my dad and I were on a schedule of one phone call every couple weeks, which was usually about his health or his truck. So nobody on Earth knew what house I was in at any given moment, including me half the time, because those Sea Ridge houses are the same house. The flooring is the same gray plank in every one of them, and the cabinets are the same white, and there's always this framed photo of a sand dollar in the hallway that is, I'm not exaggerating, the same photo 22 times across different houses. The 3 floor plans are the same plan with the stairs on the left or the right, or the garage might be flipped. I'd wake up at 2 in the morning and have to think for a second about which side of the bed the bathroom was on. I started to leave one lamp on, the floor lamp in the front room, whichever house I was in. Coming back at night off the Ridge Road, there's a long, slow bend where you can see the whole development spread out below you, and every window would be black except one. That would be the one I was staying in. It was a nice thing to have. Something about it made the whole arrangement feel less like trespassing and more like coming home. This brings me to the story you've probably been waiting for. So the first thing I couldn't explain happened at the end of the week, 6 days into that rain, on Bell Road. Bell Road was Manny's designation formerly. It's an older house, cedar shakes gone black, built into the hill so the downstairs is half underground. That house was my worst one for water. The dehumidifier down there filled its tank in about 14 hours, and I'd go back there every day. I came in around 3 in the afternoon, soaked through, and I went straight down to the lower level. The machine was running with its green light on and the fan going. When I pulled the tank out, it was empty and dry. For a second, I just stood there. A dry tank on a running machine means somebody had to have emptied it, recently enough that no condensate had come off the coil yet. And in that house on that day, that meant within about half an hour. I put the tank back and went upstairs, checking the front door. It was locked. Same with the sliding door and with the garage side door. Nothing appeared to be out of place. I didn't see any wet footprints, though I hadn't left any either, because I'd taken my boots off at the door, which was a habit of mine. The only thing I found was in the back bedroom. That bed was made up with a quilt, and there was a dent in it. A body-length dent, hip deep, right down in the middle, like when someone lies down on top of a made bed long enough to leave an impression. And when I put my hand on it, the quilt was dry and warm. The rest of that house was so damp the paperbacks on the shelf had gone wavy. I decided Manny had a key. That's what I settled on. Manny lived in Salem now, but maybe he had come back for some reason or another. Or maybe there was a neighbor with a key, or maybe Sherry had somebody else out there and had not told me. I actually texted her that night, asking if anyone else was going into Bell Road. She wrote back, "No, just you. Why?" And I wrote back, "No reason. Thought I saw tire tracks." That would be the first lie I told about it. And there would be more. I saw the woman the first time the next evening, from the deck of one of these Sea Ridge houses. This particular house sits at the end of the row with nothing between it and the beach, except a strip of shore pine and a public access stair. I'd gone out on the deck to get a signal, because the cell service out there was garbage in the rain, and I was standing under the eave with my phone up. There was a woman down on the sand. She was about 200 yards off, down toward the creek mouth, standing still with the surf coming in behind her. She wore a green rain jacket, and her hair was dark. Even that far away, I could tell she was young, and I remember thinking she was probably pretty, which is a stupid thing to be able to tell at 200 yards. But maybe it was something about the way she stood. I thought, who in God's name is out walking in this? I went back in and did the downstairs. I then came back out about half an hour later. She was still there, in the same spot, standing in the rain facing the water. Her hands were down at her sides. I wasn't scared of her, no reason to be. I was curious, though. I hadn't had a conversation with someone under 50 since Manny left. I thought about going down the access stair, saying something, but I chickened out. It's a mile of empty beach, and a strange guy walking up to you in the rain is not a nice thing to have happen. When I came back out a third time, the woman was gone. 2 nights after that, I saw 2 lamps. I'd gone into town for some pizza. It's a bigger deal than it sounds because the Ridge Road took 50 minutes each way and the pizza place shut at 8. So it was around 9, and I'm coming down the bend with my pizza, where the whole development opens up below you. And at my designated house, the lamp was on where I'd left it. But there's another light on 2 streets over. I sat in my truck at the bottom of the drive with the pizza on the passenger seat, and I looked over at it. It was the upstairs window on the north side. It was one of the houses I'd been at that same morning. I'm not a brave guy, but I was on the hook for these houses. My whole head at the moment was full of very specific and very boring fears. Did I leave a light on? If I'd left a light on, I might have left other things. And Sherry pulls the electric bills. So I drove over and I let myself in. I stood in the entry and yelled hello a couple of times, and I felt stupid doing it. The house was cold, 55 on the dot, and it smelled like those cheap plug-in air fresheners that Sherry buys in bulk. I went up the stairs, and the light was the bedside lamp in the north bedroom, on, with the shade slightly crooked. There was nothing there. The bed was made and the closet was empty except for some hangers. Nobody under it, because I looked. I will say, though, there's a certain feeling you get when you're 24 years old, on your belly, looking under a bed, with a flashlight in your teeth. It harkens back to being a child and asking Dad to look under your bed because the boogeyman is there. I turned off the lamp. I left and ate my pizza, which was now borderline cold. Now, the thing that stuck with me, though, is that I had done my walkthrough of that house at about 10 that morning. I remembered clearly being in that bedroom, because in that floor plan, the north bedroom is where the ceiling stain was that I'd been tracking for Sherry every week, penciling a line at the edge of it and writing the date to see if it was growing. and I remembered turning that lamp off this morning, especially because the switch is one of those little wheels on the cord. I remembered my hands being wet, so I had to try twice. So, who turned it back on? On day 10 of the onslaught of rain, I finished at the house at the end of the beach access. I went out to my truck, and there was a girl sitting on the bottom step of the public stair. Her hood was down in the rain, and she was eating an apple of all things. She looked up at me and said, "You're the guy that goes in all these houses." Yep, you got me. I'm the guy," she replied. "I thought you were robbing these places at first. If that was the case, you'd be horrible at it, because you take like an hour." Her name was Nell. She was 26, which she told me before I asked. "Do you live around here?" I said, because nobody really lives around here. "My aunt's place, over on Cormorant." She tipped her head in that direction. "She goes down to Arizona in October and comes back in April. Somebody's got to run the water and get the mail off the porch." "That's basically my job." "Yeah, except I do one house and you do 40. And obviously I don't get paid." She took a bite. "Green Valley, that's where she is. She says there's about 900 Oregon people down there and all they do is play cards." I asked what she did when she wasn't running the water at her aunt's. She said she was still figuring that out. Then she stopped. There was an awkward silence for a couple of seconds, so I felt pressured to say something. I explained to her that I'd started HVAC school at Clark and lasted 8 weeks, and that my dad kept a list of the jobs I had, temporarily. She nodded the whole time I was talking. "I was a dental assistant," she said eventually. "Spokane, for 4 years. I just walked out during one lunch break and never went back." "Oh, so you quit? Quit. She turned the apple around, looking for a good side. "Everybody I know who finished a program hates their life." I laughed a bit harder than the joke was worth. I don't think I'd laughed at all since October. Nell had a chipped front tooth, upper left, a little corner off of it. She caught me looking and tapped it with a fingernail. "Swing set," she said. "I was 9 years old, and I went face first into the chain." We sat at the bottom of the stairs for nearly an hour, with the rain coming down on both of us, neither one of us doing much about it. When I finally said I had 4 more houses, she stood up and brushed off the back of her jeans. "Hey, tomorrow you should tell me which one you'll be at," she said, "so I don't have to sit on a step like a stray dog." I gave her the address that night. 3 days later, I gave her the code. I was in bad shape by then, and I had never noticed it. I'd been alone since October. There was Sherry on the phone about crawl spaces and whatnot. There was a guy named Roy at the market who says about 9 words a day, and 4 of them are, "You want a bag?" A woman named Gail I saw once a month when I paid rent. At this point, I was going a little crazy, starting to talk to myself out loud in the houses as I worked. It wasn't crazy talk, honestly. It was just, okay, upstairs, to nobody, just to have a voice in the room. But then I had a girl show up out of the rain, a girl who thought my job was funny and that my life was interesting. And I fell for her about as fast as it is possible for a person to fall for someone. Just 4 days at the most is how long it took. On day 4, I was already thinking about spring, where she'd go then, and whether she would stay for me. Those next few days were the best days I'd had out there. She'd come find me at whatever house I'd told her about. Sometimes she'd already be inside when I came back from the truck, sitting sideways in an armchair with her legs over the arm, reading a paperback book she'd taken off a shelf. She read other people's vacation paperbacks the whole time I knew her, but I don't think she finished a single one. She'd get like 60 pages in one and leave it face down and start another one at the next house. She helped me sometimes too. Not with the crawl spaces, she wasn't going down there. But she'd go around and run the faucets while I did the dehumidifier thing, and she was fast at it. One night I came upstairs and she'd already flushed all 3 toilets and set the thermostat back. Then she said, "You're welcome. I've cut 11 minutes off your life." We drove into town twice on the Ridge Road. The second time we got sandwiches at the market. those turkey ones that Roy's wife makes and wraps in white paper. We sat in my truck in the gravel lot with the wipers going, and we enjoyed them. I noticed something at the time and thought it was funny. We were chewing at the same speed. Exactly the same speed. I would take a bite, she would take a bite, and our jaws were just synced up. And when I swallowed, she swallowed. I noticed it. Then I did it on purpose for a second and slowed way down and chewed like a cow. She slowed down too without ever looking at me. I laughed and said we shared the same brain cell. And she said, "Ew, are you watching my mouth when I eat?" and shoved my shoulder. There were other things I noticed and filed away as nothing at the time. She yawned when I yawned every single time within about a second. Anybody will tell you yawns are contagious, so that one didn't even register as a thing until later. Her hair was always dry. She had a green rain jacket, and the shoulders of it would be dark with water, and there would be droplets on her eyelashes. But the hair on top of her head would be dry as a bone. I assumed her hood had been up. That's what I assumed for those days. She never had a car either. Cormorant Lane to Sea Ridge is about 1.5 miles of shoulderless road with log trucks on it, and she apparently walked it in the dark and in that rain, both directions. When I offered to drive her, she always said she liked walking, so I let it go. Again, a lonely 24-year-old guy I was. A girl was walking 1.5 miles through January storm to sit in a room with me, and that made me feel special. She never told me anything about herself that I hadn't told her first. That aspect I didn't put together for months. Sitting in my dad's basement in Vancouver in the spring, I went back over it. I'd say I dropped out of a program, and she would later tell me she dropped out of something. I said my parents split when I was 12 years old, and a couple days later she said her parents split when she was 11. I said the thing I missed the most was my grandma's house in Ridgefield. I explained how it smelled, and 2 days later she was telling me about her grandma's place in Colville. Cedar chest, she said, and coffee that had been sitting on the burner since breakfast. Everything about her, everything she would say was a mirror or a bounce back off of something I'd said. And I never caught it, because at the time I really thought it was just us having a lot in common, like I'd found the perfect woman. The night after the sandwiches was when I gave her the code. It came up naturally. "So, where are you going to be tomorrow?" she asked. 4212. If I get there first, I stand out in the rain. 4409, I told her. Oh, is that the code? I nodded. That's the code to all of them, isn't it? I shook my head. They're all different, actually. That one's just 4409. Huh, she said, then went back to her book. After that, I gave her one almost every day. I'd say the address and the 4 digits, and she'd repeat them back to me once and never write them down and never got them wrong. Every night I did that, every single night, just handing over access to this woman. Day 14. I was at 4207. It was the house with the ceiling stain and the crooked lamp. I hadn't really wanted to sleep there, but the tank in that house was the second worst on the whole rotation, and I could not justify the drive. Nell had come over around 7 with a bag of the powdered donuts they sell at the gas station. We'd eaten most of them on the living room floor, with our backs against the couch. Around 11, she got up and said she was going to use the bathroom. I heard the door shut down the hall. The upstairs hallway runs 14 feet from the top of the stairs to the master door. I know the number well. I'd put tape on it in October, checking a baseboard gap for Sherry. I went up to get my phone charger. I got to the top of the stairs, and there was a woman standing at the other end. She was beautiful, young, 20-something, with dark hair and clear skin and a green jacket. She was standing there with her hands at her sides, looking at me. And she looked healthy. She looked completely and totally fine. But every single hair on my body stood straight up. I couldn't have told you why in that moment. All I knew was that my legs had gone loose, my mouth had gone dry, My entire body understood something my head was about 2 seconds behind on. Because at 14 feet, you can see a person's pores. You can see whether they blink or not. She was 14 feet away, and she looked like someone standing at the far end of a soccer field, smoothed out and filled in and too even. I said her name. Nell? I began to walk up towards her. I took 4 steps, but somehow, the door at the end, the woman ahead of me, neither of them got closer. The framed sand dollar on the right-hand wall was still on my right, at my shoulder. I should have passed it, but it was still there. I stopped. I remember reaching out and putting my hand flat on the wall because it felt like the floor below me had disappeared. Then she smiled at me. A nice smile. That's when I heard a toilet flush. The bathroom door opened on my left, 4 feet away from me, and Nell came out drying her hands on her jeans, saying, "What are you doing?" And the hallway was 14 feet long again, and there was nobody at the end of it. I told her I had gotten dizzy. She got me a glass of water and made me sit down on the stairs. She sat 2 steps below me with her hand on my knee. "When did you last eat something that wasn't a donut?" I had to actually think about it. "There was a burrito." "When?" "Yesterday." "You've gone white," she said. "Sit there. If the room starts spinning again, put your head down." She was kind about it, so nice to me. She never asked if I'd seen something. But if you find a guy standing in a hallway with his hand flat on the wall saying a name and looking up, you usually ask what he saw. But she asked what I'd eaten. The next afternoon, I was upstairs at 4118, the Ind House, at the big window in the master bedroom that looks out over the pines to the beach. Nell had gone down the access stair to look for glass floats, which she claimed washed up there, and which I'm now certain she'd never once looked for before I mentioned my grandma collected them. She was down on the sand about 150 yards out. She turned around and waved up at the window with both arms over her head, the big wave you do for someone far away. In the glass behind my own reflection, there was a woman standing in the bedroom. It was dark enough outside and bright enough inside that the glass had gone half mirror, with the bedroom laid over the beach. She was about 8 feet back near the closet, and pale. Her face was a gray-green, and the skin of it had come loose around her hairline, so there was a gap there. Her mouth was open, and the jaw hung crooked on one side, lower on the left, and her teeth were long, due to the gums pulling back off of them. I turned around so fast, I hit my elbow on the window frame. But when I did, the room was empty. The closet doors were shut, and the carpet still had the vacuum lines on it. What I thought, standing there with my elbow ringing, was, thank God. Because Nell was down on the beach. I'd been looking right at her in the same second that I saw that figure, the figure that had looked like her last time. This time they were in 2 completely different places. So maybe, whatever that gray thing was, it's not her, I thought, and has nothing to do with her, and I could go downstairs and hug her and everything would be fine. Seeing 2 of them at once means there's 2 of them. Late afternoon on the 16th day, I was at 4133 finishing up. I'd stepped out the slider onto the deck to dump a bucket over the rail. The sun was starting to set. The beach was empty except for something down by the creek mouth. I saw a person standing still down there facing the water, 200 yards away, same spot as the very first time I saw it. And I could see her face. I should not have been able to see her face that well from that distance. But just like the staircase incident, distance somehow warped. Because I could tell that the left side of her face had gone, and the socket had collapsed, so that the eye sat lower than the other. I could see the color of her skin, a mix of seafoam green and something pale and gross. Her hair was off her scalp in patches, and the hinge of her jaw was hanging. That was 200 yards, in the rain at sundown. You cannot see a person's eye socket at 200 yards. You can barely see if someone's got a hat on at that distance. So how was I able to see that? And what I saw made me so frightened that I hope I never feel that way again. What my gut told me, despite what my eyes saw, was that this thing was not 200 yards away. It only looked that way, but was much, much closer. I ran back inside and locked the slider, which wouldn't do much if someone really wanted to get inside. I stood in the kitchen and trembled. I went and got my duffel bag, and I threw my stuff in it, ready to leave. I'd sleep in the truck at Gale's. I would tell Sherry the roads were bad. I was just done tonight. Nell was standing in the front room by the lamp. I hadn't heard her come in. She said, "Where are you going with that?" I told her everything. I started with the dry tank at Bell Road, going right through the lamp and the beach and the hallway, standing there with a duffel bag in my hand, like some kid running away from home. She didn't laugh, and she didn't seem scared. She put her hands in her jacket pockets and thought for a second, then said, "How many of these houses are empty right now?" "All of them. 43. 43 houses with nobody in them." She let that sit for a moment. "Do any of them have a busted window? A door that doesn't latch?" "Probably. Bell Road's got a sliding door that sticks." "So, somebody's living out here." I began to say something, but she kept going. "Look, it's January. It's the end of the road, and it's been raining for 2 weeks straight. If there's a woman out here sleeping in one of these houses, what do you think she looks like by now? She'll look bad, rough, exactly as bad as what you're telling me." "But her face was... You saw her at 200 yards. It wasn't fully dark yet, though. Well, it was dusk in a rainstorm." She crouched in front of me, so she was looking up at me. "You've been getting up at 5. You've been doing 11-hour days for multiple weeks. You told me you talk out loud in these houses because it's too quiet in them. Your head is just filling things in, Danny. It's filling them in with the worst things it's got, and that's a completely normal thing for a head to do in your situation." I was wordless. "If you drive that road tonight in this, you're going to put the truck in the ditch on a blind turn. No one's going to find you till Monday." I put the duffel bag down. That's the moment. If there's one moment I'd take back, it's that one. And you'll soon understand why. I'd been sleeping through the rain for 2 weeks. Those Sea Ridge houses have shallow attics and a hard roof, so it was loud in there, and it seemed to get louder when the wind came around. After a couple of days, you stop hearing it, the same as you would stop hearing your refrigerator hum. I woke up at some point in the dark because it was gone. It wasn't quieter, it was just gone. I could hear the blood in my own ears. I lay there and thought the storm had finally broke, and I was actually happy for about 4 seconds. Then I sat up, and I could hear it. It was hammering. It was absolutely coming down out there. I could hear it on the roof over the hallway and on the roof over the far bedroom. I could hear it hitting the deck downstairs and running in the gutter and coming off the downspout onto the gravel. Everywhere, except the room I was in. Over that one room, the roof was silent, and the sound started again right at the doorway. At the time, Nell was asleep beside me on her side, facing away. I got up and went to the doorway and stood with my head in the hall. It was loud out there. I then moved away 8 inches, pulling my head back into the room. It was gone. I did this 3 or 4 times to be sure. I put my ear against the wall, and there was nothing on that side of it. I figured there had to be something up in the attic over that room. Insulation pushed around, or a tarp, or something somebody left up there. I got the flashlight, and I stood on the bed, going over the ceiling looking for the access hatch. There wasn't one in that bedroom, but there was a hatch out in the hallway. I got back in bed because the only other option was to be somewhere else in that house alone. I didn't want to do that. I lay there with my eyes open until it came back. And it did. It came back all at once. I looked at my phone then. It was 4:51 a.m. Nell rolled over about a minute later, placing her arm over me, saying, "You're freezing," with her eyes shut. It was day 17 of that non-stop rain. I did 9 houses. My hands had been wet for so long that the skin on my fingertips had gone soft and white. I ate a gas station burrito for lunch, standing up in some stranger's kitchen. Sherry called and told me an owner in Chandler, Arizona was threatening to pull his house from the program because of a mildew smell, asking if I could put some vinegar on it. I said sure, and I did. Nell met me at 4319 that evening. We lay on the couch and watched about 90 minutes of a movie on my laptop with the sound on low, and I fell asleep with my head on her chest. I could hear her heartbeat. It was slow and steady. I just lay there listening to it before falling asleep, and after a while I noticed something. It was beating exactly along with mine. It wasn't near or roughly mine, but every beat was at the same time as one of mine. I've had my head on somebody's chest before. I've never heard a heartbeat do that. I thought, 2 people's hearts can't just line up like that. But because I was half asleep and stupid and happy, I tested it and held my breath. If you hold your breath, your heart slows down. When I did that, I felt my heart rate go down a little bit. I held it until my chest hurt. About 50 seconds, I think. And the whole time her heart came down with mine, step for step, beat for beat, until it was going at that low, heavy pace. Then I let go, taking a big breath. My beats and hers came back up at the same time. I lifted my head and looked at her. She was watching the movie with her chin tucked down, and she looked at me, saying, "What?" "Nothing," I said, and I laid my head back down. Something was wrong, and I didn't want it to be real. I woke up in the middle of the night at around 2:30. I wasn't sure what woke me. Nell was on her side facing away from me on the other half of the bed, about 1.5 feet of space between us. There was that little bit of light you get, even in a storm at night. And she was laughing. It was quiet and low, like a little laugh you do when you're remembering something funny. 3 or 4 laughs, then a pause, then 3 or 4 more. It was completely relaxed and completely normal sounding, but it terrified me in that moment. You see, when you laugh, your body moves. Your ribs, shoulders, your back. Even a small laugh is noticeable by other people. But as I heard this laugh coming from her body was absolutely still. I was looking at her shoulder against the window, and her back under the blanket, and the sound was coming out of her, I was sure of it. And yet no part of her moved. I did not move, and I tried not to breathe too loudly. This went on for quite some time. I want to say 4 or 5 minutes, but I have no idea truthfully. Eventually it did stop, and she said something then, though I couldn't tell you what it was exactly. It didn't sound like words. After that, there was nothing. I lay there until it got light. Then I got up and did my houses as usual. If you're asking why I didn't run then, it was because I was in love. And when you're in love, You can ignore so many red flags. I had my last night at 4212 Sea Ridge Drive. Nell was inside by the time I got there. Of course she was. She was in the kitchen with the paper bag she'd started at the last house. She'd made tea in one of the mugs from the cabinet, which I would have gotten in trouble for if Sherry found out. We had a nice night. That's what really kills me here. We had a great night. She was funny. She made fun of my clipboard. "So, what happens to you in April?" she asked. "When everyone comes back?" Sherry says there's turnover work, cleaning between rentals. "And if there isn't?" "Then I go home, I guess." She was quiet for a second. "I don't want you to go home," she said. At one point, she was standing at the counter. I came up behind her, placing my arms around her. She leaned back into me. It was the most comfortable I'd ever felt in my life. We went to bed around midnight. I fell asleep on my back, and I don't remember having any dreams. When I woke up, I was on my side against her back, with my arm over her, my knees behind her knees. My face was right in the back of her hair, and the room was black except for the little green light on the smoke detector. But there was something wrong. I could feel breath hitting my face. It was slow and warm, coming in a rhythm, right on my cheek and nose, very close. My eyes were open and I was looking at the back of her head from about 3 inches away. How could there be breathing on my face? It wasn't a moment of dawning horror at the time. My brain was extremely calm and extremely slow. I thought about the smoke detector, whether it could be a fan or a vent. I thought about my own breath coming back at me off the pillow, and about the window, whether it was cracked and we didn't realize it. I went through all these explanations, one at a time, lying perfectly still, and every single one of those explanations did not hold up. I could feel that breathing, moving the little hairs by my ear. Her back was against my chest. I could feel her. I could feel her shoulder blade against my sternum, and my arm was over her ribs. And I was beginning to realize that something only a few inches from my face was breathing in and out, with a slight catch on the inhale, like somebody with a cold. I did the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life. I didn't know what else to do in that situation, but I had to know. Anyone would have to know. I didn't decide to do it, my hand just did it. I lifted my hand off her ribs, slowly so as not to wake her, and I reached up, putting my fingers into the hair at the back of her head, and gently, I began to part it. She was smiling at me. There was a face underneath her hair, a face on the back of her head. It was under the hair, about where the base of her skull should be. It was her face, the real one, the one I knew with the chipped corner on her upper left tooth. Her eyes were wide open. They were staring at me. They'd been on me the whole time, waiting for me to part that hair. Only inches away in the dark, wide open. She was smiling so wide that the skin at the corners of her eyes was creased, and the breath came out of her mouth onto mine. My fingers were in her hair on either side, holding it open. Then she spoke. "Hi." I pulled my hand out of her hair quickly, and the hair fell shut over it, becoming just the back of her head again. I went backward off that bed like a bullet, hard enough that I came down on the floor on my tailbone, and I could feel it up in my teeth. Then I kept going, pushing back on my hands and my heels until I was against the wall under the window. There was nowhere else to go. I could hardly get a breath in. I'd never had that happen before. I was pulling at the air and none of it was getting down. Then She sat up. She did it so slowly. No jolt to it, no surprise. She rose up without facing me, and when she was fully upright, she stayed that way for a couple of seconds, her shoulders square and her head straight. Then she went forward on hands and knees on the mattress and started across the bed away from me, toward the far side. I was down on the floor with my back on the wall, so my eyes were about level with the top of the mattress. All I could see of her was her head and the top of her back going across. She never turned around, not for a second of it, and I never saw the front of her. She made it to the far edge, and she went over. That's a drop of about 2 feet onto carpet. A grown person coming down off a bed onto their hands and knees will make a sound, whether they want to or not. But I didn't hear anything at all. I was sitting low enough to see straight under that bed. Those beds sit up off the floor about 8 inches, and there's nothing under them. No drawers, no storage boxes, no bed skirt, just carpet and the 4 legs. Trust me, I've been under those beds in that development with a flashlight, looking for mouse droppings, wet spots, and mold. So I had a clear view of 8 inches of open carpet running the whole way across to the far wall. But nothing came down onto it. No hands, no knees, no falling knell. I watched her go over that edge, and I never saw her come down. Then, nothing happened for a long time. The only light in that room was the green one on the smoke detector. My eyes were well adjusted to the lack of light, but still heavily depended on the blinks it gave off about every 30 seconds. And I know I sat there through several of those blinks. I then thought about the door. The door was on the same wall I was against, down at the other end, and getting to it meant standing up and crossing the open floor at the foot of the bed. I couldn't do it. I don't know if it was fear, or if it was the idea that getting to that knob meant I would have to turn my back to the far side of that room. I got chills then, just imagining it. I kept looking under the bed instead, over and over, and it was the same emptiness every time. All I knew was where she wasn't. I forced myself up then, because I had to know where she went. I did it slow, keeping my hand on the wall as I went up. My legs were a mess. I made it back to my side of the bed, placing my hand on the footboard, and I stopped. Going around the corner of it meant walking into the strip of floor on her side, and that I still couldn't see into. A few feet of carpet between the bed and the wall, and I'd be standing in it before I could look at it. So I crawled back up onto the bed instead. I put one knee on the mattress, and the whole thing dipped. The frame made a noise, and I stopped. I waited, and nothing happened. I then put another knee on it. I crawled out to about the middle of it on my hands and knees, over the sheet, over the dent where the 2 of us had been lying 20 minutes before. And the closer I got to her side, the slower I went. I got to the edge. I put one hand down on the mattress right at the seam, and I leaned over her side of the bed, looking at the floor. There was carpet, and there was the leg of the nightstand, and there was no one down there. At that exact moment, I felt breath on the back of my neck. I screamed. I've never made that sound before. Didn't even know I could. I came off that mattress and got myself turned around at the same time. I was expecting to be looking straight at her. But there was nothing on that bed. The sheet was pushed down where the 2 of us had been, and there was a dent in her pillow. But that was all. I hurried over to the door, backing up to it so I could face the room. I put my back flat against that door. I scoured that room with my eyes. I took my time doing it. I wasn't going into a dark hallway or staying in there any longer without knowing where she went. It's not a big room. I'm not sure how you're imagining it, but it's not a very big room. There's the bed, a dresser with nothing on it, and about 4 feet of open floor down either side. Then there's the closet. That's the whole room. The closet doors were shut. Surely she couldn't be in there. I stood with my back on that door for a minute or two, looking at the closet, scared the doors would fly open and there she would be, gliding towards me. But that didn't happen. All the while I was working up the courage to open the door behind me. But that courage didn't come. Not yet. So I stayed put, standing there, watching every inch of that room that I could. I then reached over sideways, without taking my eyes off of that room. I felt around until I found it. The light switch. I flicked it. The light came on. This wasn't some scary movie where the lights suddenly don't come on. The place had power just fine, and the light came on as it should. There was nothing in the room, just furniture, bed, dresser, carpet, 2 closet doors, everything as it should be. It was so ordinary and empty, and now I could see every bit of it all at once. I put my shoulder blades back on that door, and I got some breath into me at last. I remember thinking in those exact words that I was going to be okay, until 2 hands came over my shoulders from behind me. My back was on that door. My shoulder blades were touching it. I had been standing against it for a couple of minutes by then. There was nothing behind me but a closed door. Those hands came down over the front of my shoulders, onto my chest. They were wet, and it wasn't water. There was something on them with thickness to it. Those hands dragged across my skin, and I could feel my skin going tacky where it touched me. And that smell came at the same time. That smell of what washes up on the beach after a storm and just lies there in a line on the sand for weeks. Then both hands came up off my chest, and the fingers went in my mouth. I didn't have time to do anything about it. They went in past my teeth, and I felt the knuckles on my tongue, and I felt one of them at the back of my throat. It tasted like a crab pot that's been sitting out in the sun. I went forward. I don't know if I jumped or if my legs did it without me. I came down on hands and knees on the carpet in front of the bed, and I began to vomit. But nothing came up. I kept heaving anyway, 4 or 5 times, my head hanging down and my hands flat on the floor. I turned around then and looked back at the door. There was nobody there, of course there wasn't, and the door was still shut. I stayed down there heaving and spitting on the carpet, not bringing anything up. At that moment, I wasn't paying any attention at all to where I was in that room. I'd gone forward maybe 6 feet. My back was nearly touching the end of the bed. But then the light started to go. I thought it was the light bulb, that the bulb was going out on me all of a sudden. Darkness came down from the top of my vision, and it was coming down slow and even all the way across. It took me a second to realize. It was hair. Hair came down over my face from right above me, and it kept coming. It went past my eyes and down my chin. She was up on that bed right behind me, leaning out over the top, just over my head. She spoke only one more word, and that word was, "Stay." I practically tackled the door then, barging into it full force before I ever got the knob turned. I put my shoulder into it, and the top corner went in. One of the hinges tore out of the jamb with a sound like a board coming off a pallet. Then it was open. I was in the hallway. I ran down the stairs, missing the last 3, and coming down on my side on the floor at the bottom. I got up. My keys were on the kitchen counter where I'd left them. I ran out the front door after grabbing them, and I got into the truck, driving as fast as I could. Throughout all of this, I was in my underwear. No shoes, no jacket. The entire way up the ridge road, I kept feeling something behind the seat. I wasn't hearing anything, and I never once looked back in the mirror. I don't know what I would have done if I had. It was on the back of my neck and across the top of my shoulders. I'd put my hand back there and feel nothing, but then 30 seconds later it would be there again. I did this the entire way over the ridge, taking those blind turns way too fast in the dark, one hand constantly going behind my own head, over and over. I got to Gale's a little before 6, going up the outside stairs. I put some clothes on, and I did that without turning on a single light. I was in too much of a hurry, too scared. Problem was, my wallet was on the nightstand at 4212, the house I had just run away from. I knew exactly where it was, but I wasn't going back for it. There was about $60 cash in the drawer by the sink at my place, so I took that. I didn't leave Gale a note, and I didn't call Sherry. I drove straight to my dad's, arriving a little after 10 in the morning. He opened the door and looked at me and said, "Okay," and stepped back to let me in. Somebody had to go out to 4212 to fix that door. That's a hinge and probably the jamb and probably the whole slab. It would be coming out of Sherry's pocket, or out of the owner's. But I wasn't going back there. I still owe her for the door. Well, that was a first. A love story / work story / ghost story? And I don't know about all of you, but that gave me some serious Obsession vibes. If any of you have not seen that movie yet, go do it. It's freaking creepy and a fun ride. I never knew a 5-foot woman could be so creepy, till that movie and apparently this story. Good night. Thank you all so much for tuning into this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. You can send me your scary work-related stories over at eeriecast.com/submit. And you can support the show by becoming a member over at erie.fm, where you can listen to all our shows without ads if you're a premium member, and unlock hours of bonus stories, podcasts, and audiobooks. Your membership helps us stay afloat, and it's very, very much appreciated. Till next time, everyone, I've got to clock out, but I'll be back again real soon. Hey, I'm glad you came back with some kindling for the fire, but whatever you do, do not leave the campsite. Ever since you've been gone, I've been seeing these tall, dark shapes moving between the trees. Dozens of them. Whatever they are, they seem scared of the light. I'm scared, but I think we can make it until morning if we keep the fire going. Wait. No. It's starting to rain. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and you can follow me on Twitter at Dark Prevails if you'd like to see a very scary trail cam video of a deer and some sort of unexplained creature or entity caught in the background. Today, I've got a new set of scary camping stories to make you get the shiver shakes the next time you look into the deep, dark woods. Enjoy, and don't forget to send me your scary stories at darkstories.org so I can narrate them on the show. And go to eeriecast.com for more creepy podcasts. Now, let's begin. I was followed by something for 4 years. From Theolite Faye. These events happened when I was between 11 and 15 years old. I had never been one to fully believe in the paranormal, but I do accept that even if I haven't seen something strange myself, it's probably out there somewhere, waiting for me to run into it. This was one of those experiences. The first encounter I had with this entity was when I was 11 years old. I was living in the Southwest United States. My friend, his dad, my dad, and I were doing an overnight campout in one of our favorite camping spots. which was located a little ways from a relatively calm river. It was secluded, but close enough to public roads we could leave quickly if we needed to. The day went smoothly, and we settled into sleep after a good hike along the river. I shared a tent with my friend, while our fathers shared another. Sleeping on campouts has always been difficult for me, so I was the last one to fall asleep. I think I fell asleep sometime around 11 p.m. I woke up in the middle of the night, suddenly. I looked at my watch. It said 2 a.m. Right away I wondered why I was awake. That's when I heard something moving around outside the tent. No problem, I thought. It's just my father or my friend's father moving around. Probably had to go relieve themselves. That thought was quickly wiped from my mind, however, as I heard the movement continue with no sound of a tent zipper or tent fabric. Naturally, as an 11-year-old with an overactive imagination, I quickly hunkered down into my sleeping bag, terrified of what it could be. That's when the entity yipped. If you're familiar with coyotes, you know they don't really howl, but they let out a series of yips and whines. This was the sound the entity made, and continued to make. A series of yips and whines followed by snuffling and more movement around the tent. Surprisingly, my friend did not wake up, nor did I hear anyone stirring about in the other tent. Whatever this thing was, it was snuffling and walking right next to the tent wall, occasionally yipping loudly. Normally, when coyotes make these calls, they're answered by other coyotes, but nothing else responded to this thing's calls or whines. Eventually, the sounds stopped though, and at some point I managed to fall asleep. The next morning, I was the first one up and out of the tents. I had to see if I could find anything that would show there was a coyote outside of the tent the previous night. I looked for anything I could think of. Paw prints, shed hair, even scat, but there was nothing within a 100-foot radius of our campsite. Not even paw prints in the soft soil near the tents, nor in the sand on the riverbank. When I asked my friend and our fathers if they had heard anything the previous night, they all replied that they had slept soundly, and they hadn't heard a thing. After another search, none of us found anything coyote-related either, though my friend did find a human footprint in the sand along the riverbank. No, it wasn't a shoe print. It was a bare human footprint. We packed up camp and left after breakfast, and nothing else of note happened. A day later, however, there was a massive summer storm. The river near the campsite flooded, completely wiping out the spot where we had camped 2 days prior. At the time, I thought this was simply a coincidence. However, my second experience with this entity changed my mind. The second experience with this thing happened about a year after the first. I was 12 years old then, still living in the same area. It was another summer night, and I'd taken to sleeping on the covered balcony of our house, where I could use the night breeze to stay cool. I'd gone to bed early that night, tired after a long day outside. But I woke up in the middle of the night, around 1 a.m. I felt very uneasy for some reason. That's when I heard the yipping again, that familiar yipping, and once again it had no responses and no other calls, just that solitary yipping of what should have been a single coyote. This time, however, I decided I wanted to see what was out there for myself before it had a chance to disappear. The balcony faced the front of the house, thankfully in the same direction as that yipping. I looked out of the wire screen that covered the balcony window in the direction of the sounds and where I assumed the entity would be. What I saw was anything but a coyote. It crouched on 2 legs, and from my vantage point, I could roughly guess it was about the size of a grown man, hunched over. In the darkness, I couldn't make out anything beyond the rough humanoid shape of the entity. It never looked up towards the balcony window, just shambled along before disappearing behind a row of houses, yipping every so often. That night, I wasn't able to go back to sleep. The following day was miserably wet and stormy. These weather conditions were nearly identical to that of the storm after the previous encounter. I didn't have another encounter for another 3 years after that. My final encounter with this entity happened when I was 15. I say final encounter, but for all I know, this creature is still out there, still following me. Anyway, by this time I was living in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. One day I'd gotten off the bus and I was walking back towards my house when I noticed movement at the edge of the road on the opposite side of where I stood. When I looked up, I locked eyes with a coyote. Normally, from my experience, wild animals avoid eye contact as much as possible, and making eye contact is typically a surefire way to agitate them. Quickly, I broke eye contact, still keeping an eye on the animal. But my gaze kept coming back to its eyes. They looked like a normal coyote's eyes, but there was something more than just the regular canine intelligence in them. The coyote stared at me, unmoving, for what seemed like hours, but was only a few minutes, before it turned around and loped off away from the road. I waited until I couldn't see it anymore, before I started walking again, heading home. That night, there was a thunderstorm that shook the house violently with every thunderclap, and the wind was strong enough to push the trees that sat behind our house to their breaking point. When I woke up the next morning, I found that a tree had fallen diagonally across our yard, missing the corner of the house where my bedroom was by only a few feet. To this day, I still don't know if the entity I encountered was anything strange, or if it was just a string of bizarre coincidences. Anyone who knows about coyotes knows they live pretty much everywhere in the United States, so they're not uncommon. But I know what I saw, and I don't think the storms after every encounter are just coincidences. Was this entity trying to warn me? Was it bringing the storms with it? Some part of me wants to meet this entity again, no matter what it might be, just so I can get some sort of closure, get closer to figuring out what it was. I don't think I'll ever know, but to this day, whenever I hear a coyote call, I immediately associate it with the sound and smell of rain. I stared death in the eyes. From Anonymous. This happened 13 years ago. I was 33, living alone in Montana. I am a hunter, like my father and his father, so I've had my experiences with animals. On the morning in question, I planned to go on a camping trip by myself. The spot I'd planned to go to was deep into the woods at a remote campsite. I drank a mug of coffee, packed my bags, and grabbed my belt, which had a .500 Magnum in its holster. I called my brother and asked him to come pick up my dog and take her back to his place. Then I was on my way. Nothing much happened on the drive there, although when I got to the trail, everything was silent. I assumed it was because I just pulled in, so I continued to the path. The entire hike, I never heard a bird, a bug, or even the rustling of branches. It was all just silence. After around 2 hours of this, I was officially on edge. I kept my hand on my gun because honestly, I felt as if I was being stalked by some kind of predator. After 3 hours of my hike, I came to the campsite. As I was setting up my tent, the sounds of nature resumed, and I felt relieved. To say this campsite was beautiful would be an understatement. It was on a ridge overlooking the small town I lived in. I threw my bag in the tent, and I began to unpack. Suddenly, all at once, everything went silent again. It wasn't quiet for long. The silence was soon broken by the sounds of the trees knocking against each other in the wind. I set up my sleeping bag, and when I left the tent, I took a can of beans out of my food bag, then put the rest in a tree. That's when I heard a twig snap around 20 feet into the woods. I turned around, my hand on my gun, and watched the forest. Still and unmoving, I saw nothing. I sighed and shrugged my shoulders, trying to relieve some tension. As I tried to start a fire to cook my food, I heard rustling, followed by frantic but massive footsteps. I pulled out my gun, and once again, I turned around. The iron sights were aimed at the center mass of what I can only describe was a demon. What I was looking at had the legs and horns of a goat and stood on 2 feet. It had a brown, hairy body and human-looking arms. But I swear, its face was like that of a kangaroo, and its eyes emanated pure malice. It inched closer to me from the woods, and I fired a shot into the air, trying to scare it. In response to that, the creature screamed, sounding more like a fox, a deer's mating call, and the most painful, blood-curdling human scream I'd ever heard, all mixed into one. I blinked, and the thing was soon right in front of me. Its snout was nearly touching me. Those yellow, almost lizard-like eyes were stabbing right into my soul. I felt that if I moved, it would kill me. I don't know how. It was this feeling that dominated me. I slowed my breathing, and as I did, the creature pushed me to the ground. Without breaking eye contact, I jumped back up and stood there. It came up to me again and screamed. This scream seemed to shake the entire forest. In response, I threw my hands up and screamed back. It just kept staring at me, toying with me. I put my gun directly to its throat and screamed again, "Back off!" It still stood there, so I pulled the trigger. As my ears rang, I screamed again, and I watched the creature run back into the woods. I began to quickly pack up my things, and whenever I looked up, I saw it, staring at me, now from a distance. This terrifying thing followed me down the path all the way to my motorcycle. I sped out of there, at least going 30 miles per hour over the speed limit. I heard it scream one last time as I got onto the main road that leads to the town I live in. To be truthful with you, something in me wants me to go back. I want to see if I can kill that thing, hang its head on my mantle. But I do not think it would end well. Now I've got a wife and 2 kids, and I can't afford to just throw my life away hunting some forest demon. Something in the corn. From Anonymous. This story takes place in the summer of 2012. I was 13 years old at the time. I lived out in the country in a small farm town in central Illinois. Our home was surrounded by tall cornfields all summer long, until it was time for harvest. The corn never really bothered me, considering I'd grown up around it my whole life. But this summer was different. I was the only one of my friends who lived in the country, so naturally, they would always want to come to my house because there was more for us kids to do. I'd always been the outdoorsy type, and so was my best friend Max. During that particular summer, Max was over at my house a lot. We would do things like walk down to the creek and do some fishing, go swimming in our pool, have bonfires, build shelters out in the back, and usually, when it got dark, we'd go inside into my room and play video games. This particular time I'm talking about was different, though. We decided to do something we didn't normally do. That weekend, we would camp in the backyard with our little 2-person tent and a small fire pit. My parents' property was not huge, but it did have a decent-sized backyard and loads of trees. Since we were too young to do any real camping, this was our only option. This way, we could pretend the backyard was the forest, and if anything went wrong or we got scared, we could just walk up the property to the house and give up if we felt like it. Not that we planned on doing that, though. That evening, after setting up our little campsite and cooking some food over the fire, we eventually got tired and decided to go to bed early. Usually, I would be too creeped out to do this by myself, but my buddy Max was with me, and I also had my dog, who, funnily enough, was also named Max. Confusing, right? Anyway, we were in the backyard. Now, my parents' bedroom had a large sliding glass door and balcony that came off the back of the house, so I knew my parents would occasionally peer out to check on us throughout the night. This gave me a bit of comfort. Once in the tent, we lay down in our sleeping bags to get comfortable. My dog stayed outside the tent and roamed the yard as he normally did. He was an outside dog, after all. I don't remember much after that, not until the weirdness went down. Once we fell asleep, we must have stayed asleep for a good while. I don't remember really waking up much or tossing and turning. Then again, this was years ago, so small details like that are far from my mind. Now this is where the creepiness takes place. Randomly, I just woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of my dog barking hysterically. His barks sounded mean and vicious. He was not happy about whatever he saw, which wasn't like him at all. My dog was usually a gentle boy. He rarely barked at cars or strangers as it was, so this really caught me off guard. As I slowly woke up and rubbed my eyes, I noticed what my dog was barking at, even from the tent. Because I didn't see it, I heard it. Some strange erratic whistling seemed to be coming from no particular direction. It was so loud, too. It was definitely human whistling. No animal sounds like this, at least not to my knowledge. It was such a weird whistle, although human, it didn't have any specific rhythm or pattern to it. It was just so odd sounding. If I had to guess, this whistling sounded as if it was a beckoning call, most likely for my dog. Honestly, even though this could have been my dad pulling a prank, it freaked me out pretty bad in that moment. However, it only got much worse. I promptly woke up my buddy Max. It took many shakes and shouts to finally get him to wake up, but once he did, I didn't even have to say a word. He heard the whistling immediately, and we both looked at each other in silent terror. My second instinct after waking my buddy up was to check my phone. It was 3 a.m. That's the witching hour according to some. Me, being a believer in the supernatural, knew this, as did my buddy. I didn't even have to say anything. I just showed him the time, and he looked at me even more freaked out. "What is that?" Max asked. "I don't know, dude," I replied. Max suggested I call my dad to see if it was him doing all that whistling. So I did. The phone rang about 3 times, and finally my dad picked up the phone, sounding groggy. He asked, "What, son? I'm trying to sleep." To my horror, even as my dad spoke through the phone, the whistling never stopped, nor did the barking. I knew then it couldn't be my dad. I asked if my mom was in bed with him. To this, he replied, "Yes, why?" "Dad, there's somebody on our property whistling, and the dog's barking like crazy. We're really scared." All my dad said was, "It's probably a bird." I was angry that he was so quick to shut me down, not even trying to listen for himself. "Come back to the house then. What do you want me to do?" I hung up then. He wasn't going to help us. If we stayed out here, that meant possibly dealing with whatever that thing or person is. I told my buddy we had to book it back to the house. To which he replied, "Well, let's go then, hurry. I'm not staying out here." So I unzipped the tent as fast as I could, and we both went sprinting quickly back to the house. As we ran, I finally could tell what direction the whistling was coming from. It was coming from the west side of the property, from the cornfields. I didn't dare look in that direction. I just ran. As we got to the back door, I finally saw my dog. He was still barking in that general direction. He was close against the house, keeping his distance from that thing. I swung the door open, and we got inside as fast as we could. For a few seconds, I stood at the door, calling for my dog to come back in the house with us. He wouldn't listen, though. He just kept barking. After getting frustrated and fearful for his life, I ran out to grab him by his collar so I could drag him inside myself. Just as I did this, the whistling seemed to get closer. This thing was coming in closer towards us. As I reached my dog, he suddenly decided to bolt past me and towards whatever that thing was in a violent manner. Whatever it was, my dog was now full sprint after this thing, chasing it. I yelled his name once more before slamming the back door and locking it. I was afraid my dog would be attacked or possibly killed, but we had to save ourselves. As we got into the safety of the house, we made sure all the doors were locked. My dad came down then to talk to us, and we explained to him what happened. For some reason, my dad seemed to think it was ridiculous and that we had imagined the whole thing. Of course, this made us furious. "Go listen then," we encouraged him. We watched as my dad went over to a window and opened it up to listen outside. Nothing. The noises had stopped. No whistling, no barking. My dad, thinking that he proved his point, went back to bed, suggesting that we do the same. But we couldn't. We were terrified. We were worried about my dog, too. We decided to go online, looking up noises that might match what we heard. But nothing at all sounded like it. At a certain point, we finally decided to rationalize for the sake of falling asleep that night. We just told ourselves it was some coyotes. But we knew it wasn't that, deep down. The following day, my parents went off to work. Max and I were there home alone, and we decided to go out looking for my dog. Almost immediately after going outside, we found him. He was running around, happy as ever, looking totally normal. No injuries whatsoever. We decided whatever it was, he must have chased it off. Being a lot less afraid now, and it being daytime, and that thing seeming to be gone, we pulled out the dirt bikes from the garage and went riding around the property. Everything was going great until I came around the corner on one of our usual routes. I saw my friend Max stopped in the middle of the track. He was still on his bike, but it was turned off now, and he signaled for me to do the same. I shut off my engine, and I asked him what was wrong. To this, he looked at me with big eyes. I heard it again," he said, and he pointed at the nearby cornfield. I thought he was messing with me, but I could tell after my second time asking him about this, he wasn't. He was truly terrified, and now so was I. Needless to say, we spent the rest of the day indoors. I never did see the thing, only heard it, but I think maybe that's for the best. I'm 23 now, I've got a wife and daughter, and I don't live there anymore. So I've never heard it again, not even the rest of the time I lived there before moving out. I hope I never do hear it again, to be honest. I thought it was a deer. From Anonymous. I've always been a lover of the paranormal and supernatural. It's been a special interest of mine, It's something I've poured my heart into, and I've spent hours researching to learn more about. Now, when I was in 6th grade, we had an essay to write. We could do anything we wanted, just so long as we did research, and told a lot on the topic. My classmates went with stories of fishing or making things. You know, normal 6th grade topics. I, of course, went the supernatural route. I chose to research skinwalkers. Ever since seeing an episode of a paranormal investigative show where they went to Skinwalker Canyon, I'd been amazed by the idea of these creatures. I spent hours looking into folklore, learning all I could. My final essay ended up being around 12 pages long, and I was incredibly proud. My classmates thought it was a little weird of me to do this, and some teachers were worried, but it never ended up causing me any trouble. It was rather ironic that I chose this for my essay, seeing as how the information I learned did nothing to help me realize what happened to me that July. The summer between 6th and 7th grade, we were moving houses. We weren't going very far, just about 15 minutes away, so we could be closer to my grandmother. The house we lived in at the time was surrounded by dense woods, which my younger brother and I had always spent much of our time in. We didn't have much property, but we did have a nice area of the forest to run around in and explore. We knew almost every square inch of the land. Back then, I loved the outdoors, and I would play out there for hours at a time. I felt comfortable out there, especially when I had my dogs with me. My house sat on a very small hill, and we had a small porch on the backside, looking out into the woods. It was just big enough to hold our grill, or maybe a few camping chairs, and I would often stand out there at dusk, listening to the sounds of the forest at night. The tree line was about 20 yards away from there, and the angle made it so whoever was on the porch would be a good 6 or 7 feet above the ground at the tree line. One night in July, I was standing out there as usual. I'd been sitting there, reading one of my favorite books, and just relaxing. I was around 12 years old at the time, and I had a very short attention span. Once I was done reading, I got to my feet and leaned against the railing, looking out into the trees. After a few moments, I realized I could hear something walking around in the woods. Since we lived so close to the forest, we often got deer that walked through, sometimes coming right up to our house if we were silent enough. Naturally, I went quiet, waiting for a deer to come out of the bushes. Sure enough, after about 30 seconds, I saw a pale, slender shape stepping out from the brush. There was a brief moment of excitement to see such a pretty creature before my enthusiasm was replaced by confusion. This deer didn't look quite right. Its neck was just a little too long, and its limbs seemed thin and spindly. It shouldn't be able to stand on legs that thin. Surely it would have collapsed from the weight of its own body. But somehow, it was perfectly steady on its hooves as it walked towards me. I felt no fear yet, just confusion and fascination. As it got closer and closer, I realized that no deer should be this close to a human being. It looked directly at me, and I knew it was aware of my presence. With the thrill of terror, I realized maybe this deer had rabies or was sick. There was no way the deer could get on the porch with me, but I still slowly backed away from the railing, going inside and locking the door behind me. I thought about it for a moment, then shrugged it off, deciding this was just a sick deer. I told my mother about the deer, worried for our dogs or my brother. I didn't want them to get attacked by it or possibly get whatever made that deer sick. My mother immediately went on alert and kept my brother and the dogs inside for the next few days. We moved away that week, though it wasn't related to the sighting of the sickly animal. I never saw that deer again or another one like it. It's been several years since the encounter, and I'd forgotten about it until a few nights ago. My interest in the paranormal has remained with me, and I've continued to look into these creatures. I was searching through the cryptid tags on an app, and I found videos of creatures called not deer. Immediately interested, I searched up these beings, and after looking at the information for a few moments, the memories of that night in July came back to me. It was starting to make sense to me. The deer's appearance and behavior perfectly matched the stereotypical behavior of not deer. The story that I thought I made up with my 12-year-old imagination had actually been true. I was rather embarrassed for not realizing what this creature was until all these years later, considering how much I'd looked into these folklore beings. However, I decided to ignore the embarrassment and share my story instead. If I see another creature like this, I'll be sure to share more. In the days since realizing what my encounter was, I found myself looking into the woods more, wondering if I'll see a pair of big eyes staring back. Don't visit Pripyat. From Silver Bullet 54. In 2020, I went to Europe with 4 friends. We chose to visit the Ukrainian town of Pripyat. Before we went, we made sure to get clearance and also get Geiger counters to make sure we were in a safe zone. We figured one day in couldn't hurt, as long as we stayed together. So we decided that we would explore, camp, pack up, and leave. Sadly, I wish it had been that easy. When we first arrived, my friend Kevin mentioned how silent and eerie it was. We saw the clocks at 11:55, then saw the abandoned amusement park. Mid-ride bumper cars, a creaking Ferris wheel, and an uncanny stillness was all that was left. It was like a giant void had opened up and sucked away all the people that once lived here. Our counters were showing very low levels of radiation, which was a good sign. But we knew if any of us began feeling strange, we were to book it out of there immediately. Now, a friend of mine, Brandon, had mentioned that the animals around here had been horribly affected. And believe it or not, we saw a wolf skulking around the area alone. We kept our distance and watched it, and when it turned towards us, we quickly averted our eyes to avoid challenging it. But when I happened to glance towards it for one moment, I saw just what was wrong with its eyes. Now, I'm no scientist or zoologist, so I don't know if the radiation caused it, but the wolf's eyes had gone completely white. I couldn't tell the cornea, iris, and pupil apart. Even though I figured it was blind, it was clearly sniffing around, so I'm sure it could have smelled us. Fortunately, he seemed to sense 5 scents and left without attacking. Brandon then said, "Let's go set up camp in one of those buildings. I'm not sure what it is, but I feel like something doesn't want us here." The other 3 were feeling uneasy as well, and I was still on edge after that wolf encounter. We all soon found an empty building with very little radiation and a roof to sleep under. I won't forget what happened next, though. Before I go on, I'll tell you now that I suffered no headaches, I did not feel lightheaded, and I had experienced no nausea, vomiting, or any other ill effects. So the radioactivity wasn't what caused this, it wasn't a hallucination. I woke up with a start when I heard a weird moaning sound. It was like a lawnmower that was about to die. I was about to ask anyone else in the group if they heard that, but all 4 were already sitting up and listening. "Okay," I said. "We can all confirm we just heard that." Brandon swallowed and replied, "I think I know what doesn't want us here." He then pointed behind my friend Grant. We all looked and screamed like we were trying to raise the dead. There stood a person. They were about 6.5 feet tall with bead red skin, They had two completely red eyes, and what appeared to be a new, vestigial, deformed limb protruding from their left arm. I then asked, "Does radiation even do that?" The other four just ran with their things, and I quickly followed. When I looked back, the man was just standing there, swaying and groaning as if he couldn't control his own movements and behavior. As soon as we got back home, Brandon left to see his parents, while Grant and I confirmed that what we saw was a possible victim of radiation. Kevin and Maria, the other two, refused to talk about it, and I never brought this up again until now. So if you go to Pripyat, I suggest you keep your eyes and ears open. The radiation is still there, and some people either couldn't or wouldn't leave. You might run into an unfortunate radiation victim. So in all honesty, maybe it's not the best place to go. You can pay in the morning. From Mrs. Trash Panda. This is a story from my grandparents and my aunt. When my family goes camping, my grandpa can sleep anywhere, literally. But the second he tells you to pack it up and get out of there, you listen. You pack your things and you get back in the car. If I recall correctly, my grandparents and my aunt, who was around 7 or 8 at the time, were on their way down to Tennessee to pick up my mom and uncle, who had gone down there with friends for a vacation. While it was getting late into the afternoon, my grandparents pulled into a gas station up in the mountains of Tennessee. As a side note, I think it was somewhere near Gatlinburg. They like to sightsee a lot, so it wasn't unusual for them to go out of their way during a trip. They asked if there was a campground nearby, so they could sleep for the night. The lady at the counter of the gas station told them there was a gated campground about 5 miles down the road. Of course, my grandpa said okay, and drove down those 5 miles. At this point, my grandma was getting very uneasy. She asked my grandpa if he was sure this is where they wanted to stay. He said yes. I'd assume he was probably tired of driving at that point, and didn't mind where they stayed. They pulled up to the gate, and it was closed. There was a sign up that said, "Welcome, help yourself, and you can pay at the office in the morning." My grandpa had my grandma get out and open the gate. He pulled the camper through, and my grandma closed the gate back up. She got in the truck, and they drove down a huge hill. When they made it to the bottom, they found a campsite and parked the camper and started to get things ready for the evening. Now, this is the part that turned the whole trip for them into something ominous. As my grandma got everything set up and started cooking dinner, she looked up and she saw my aunt playing around outside while my grandpa was pacing up and down the length of the campsite. She said he just kept mumbling to himself. Finally, he grabbed my aunt, put her in the camper, and told my grandma in a panicked voice to stop and pack everything up. He said they needed to leave immediately. Of course, this confused my grandma, but she listened anyway and packed things up. She got my aunt and everything settled back in. My grandma asked my grandpa what was going on, and he replied, "We can't sleep here. We have to leave." So he started the truck up and basically floored it up the huge hill with the camper. They came up to the gate again, and my grandma had to once again get out to open and close it. After that, they drove for about an hour before finally stopping at a very well-lit truck stop. The next day, when they reached their destination, they told their friends that they had stopped at this campground that was gated. I guess this shook my grandpa because when one of their friends exclaimed that people had gone missing in that exact area, my grandpa began thanking God for having the instincts he had. When they got home to Michigan, they'd found out that over the past 2 weeks alone, 8 people had gone missing from that exact area, and they had nearly stayed the night there. Thank God my grandpa had a bad feeling and listened to it. My experience with the Wendigo. From Love Malfoy 5858. I live in New Jersey. This took place when I was around 10 or 12. Our school had organized a camping trip to the Bass River State Forest. Of course, being the adventurous kid I was, I instantly signed up. The day on which the trip was organized was in the winter, so we bundled up in cozy winter clothes before going on the 3-day camping trip. The trip started like any other. We got on the bus, teachers assigned us in groups, and all that stuff. We got off the bus with our camping gear and immediately sat to work. While we worked, however, I had this strange feeling that I was being watched. I brushed it off, thinking there's nothing wrong with that, there's lots of animals out here after all. As soon as I had this thought, a howl of some sort resounded from the woods all around me. Startled, I dropped the hammer I was holding to hammer pegs. The noise had startled me, as even though my friend said it was nothing, it sounded more human than animal, but with still some traces of wolf in it. It's hard to explain, it was so bizarre. I pushed the occurrence to the back of my mind, and I tried to enjoy the trip. Nothing besides that really happened on the first day. On the evening of the second day, we all lit a fire as it was cold. We were having a really good time, toasting marshmallows and singing songs. A few hours passed and the fire began to dwindle. We all went out in different directions in the woods to cover more ground, searching for more kindling. I had chosen to go through the most scary-looking part of the forest, as, like I said, I was adventurous. I had been picking up sticks for nearly 10 minutes before realizing the forest was quiet. Too quiet. This silence was deafening. I suddenly heard a twig snap near the tree line. I jumped in shock and looked around for the source of the noise. I called out to see if anyone was there, but then my voice seemed to echo. Seemed to.
Anybody there?
I say this because my echo sounded much more disturbing, much more inhuman. I got scared, dropping all the sticks I was carrying, and ran for my life. Behind me, I could hear twigs snapping. I never felt so terrified. I ran for a few minutes, and the twig snapping seemed to have stopped. I turned back to see. That was a big mistake. What I saw will be forever etched into my mind. A huge wolf, standing on 2 legs with what appeared to be antlers, was looking down at me, and I swear it looked as if it was smiling. I saw rows of razor-sharp teeth that could tear through bone like paper. I practically flew to the campsite and only stopped when I saw my best friend Allison. When I made it to her, I cried at her feet, breaking down. She asked what was wrong, pointing towards the woods from where I came from. Then I blacked out. When I woke up the next day in my tent, with worried faces all around me, I explained to everyone that I saw a wolf. That's all I could say. I knew no one would ever believe what I actually saw. The third day, I stayed inside, terrified that I might see that awful creature again. Nowadays, I'm very wary of going into the woods, and I never stray too far anymore. If you ever encounter a creature like this, I advise you to run for your life as well. Abandoned racetrack. From Anonymous. I live in a semi-rural area in Vermont. It's quite peaceful, but the characters here can sometimes be unsettling. This story happened about 2 years ago, in 2020 as of writing this. It was June, and my friends and I were about to graduate high school. We were all set on going to graduation and hanging around after, but my buddy gave us all an idea. Let's go to the racetrack my cousin told me about. It looks cool. We can party there instead of going to graduation. We had all collectively decided that we were going to go. The day of the trip, we spent our time getting food, drinks, and whatever else we needed to have a good time. Around 2:30 p.m., we headed out to said racetrack. It was about an hour or so away from where we all lived, so we didn't mind the drive. On the way there, my friend drops the haul on us. "Hey, this racetrack is abandoned. Not sure what's in it, but there's supposedly people in the basement." We all chuckled at this, brushing off the idea of people being held up in some abandoned racetrack. Upon our arrival, we noticed the place was massive. We parked around the basement entrance for easy escape if needed. We got unpacked and headed to the top floor. On our way in, we noticed a pillar with the words, "Welcome to Hell, Run," spray painted on it. We thought that was weird for sure, but we pushed forward. We soon made it to the 3rd floor, and we noticed we couldn't go up any further due to a collapse on the top floor. We all set up camp on the 3rd floor, and the partying began. After we all got a decent buzz going, we decided to explore the place by playing Manhunt. Mind you, this whole place was only lit by the moon, so it was pitch black in there. Me and a close friend of mine, named Susan, were finding the rest of my friends first. We started in the basement. When we entered the basement, the most foul stench hit me. It was like old books and decomposed dead things. We got farther into the basement when we began to hear feet shuffling. We thought this was one of our friends, so naturally, I made my way around the noise to surprise him and locate him. I was wrong. Fast forward a few minutes later, we noticed a mask sitting on a table. We looked at the mask and realized it was some sort of animal skin and staples made into a mask. We both thought this was disturbing and went to tell the others that we weren't alone. We got up to the 2nd floor stairs that led to the 3rd when a bottle smashed next to Susan's feet. Susan screamed. I consoled her and told her it was just our friends playing jokes on us. I looked up the stairs and, sure enough, my friend threw a bottle. He was laughing it off now. I turned in a different direction, and I nearly soiled myself. Standing at the end of the 2nd floor were 2 cloaked and masked figures. I turned to Susan and immediately told her to run. "That's not funny. Stop," she yelled. So I picked her up and physically made her look at what I saw. Then she screamed again. The chase was on. The cloaked figures started walking towards us. I then screamed to the rest of my friends that we were not alone in here. As Susan and I ran away, my friends came running down from a separate stairway and met us at the front entrance. It took me a minute to catch my breath and explain what I saw. After I said this, my friend goes into his truck, pulling out a 12-gauge Winchester shotgun. "Even so," he says, "what are you talking about? There's no way that—" He was immediately interrupted by the sight of one of those figures. Holy crap! My other friend who was with us drew his pistol and handed it to me. "I'll sit with Susan. You guys go get our stuff," he said calmly. 2 more of my friends and I went back into the racetrack. We took an alternate route to the 2nd floor stairs. But on our way, we noticed a door was open. We all crept towards the door and noticed there was a light coming from inside. I kicked open that door. Inside, we found a pentagram with candles around it. Also around it was the mask I pointed out earlier. But what really messed with me was looking to my left, seeing the wall ripped apart. And as I took a closer look, above the huge hole in the wall were the words "Death Leap." I looked inside that wall, and to my surprise, there was a drop all the way to the basement. We quickly left that room and grabbed our things. We exited the building, but noticed 6 to 7 figures dispersing from the side of it. They were leaving too, but we didn't care. We packed and drove away. On our way out, those same figures stopped walking and began to stare us down. We've never gone back there. all of us decided to brush it off as satanic worshippers who decided to mess with me and my friends. And I hope that's all it was. Swedish Forest, from Nicholas L. I'm from Denmark. My friend and I had planned a fishing trip deep into the Swedish forest. This was back in 2007. My friend Matthias accompanied me. We went quite deep into those woods, and we were amazed by the beautiful nature out there, not really paying enough attention to where we were or how deep we'd gone. We soon found a really nice spot to start fishing. It was this little sandy beach. We started fishing, eventually losing track of time, when at one point we discovered some footprints in the sand. We studied them closer, and they looked like bear tracks. Now, everyone always says don't run from a predator, but do you know how hard it is not to run in that situation? Well, we began to hear rustling from the bushes a few feet away from us. Matthias and I stopped in our tracks and began to listen. It was like the entire forest went silent. There we were, still holding our fishing poles, just staring at these bushes, trying to see what was in there, when suddenly a snout pops out of them. We jumped back, and we were about to run, when a bear emerged from those bushes. Shocked by this huge animal, which we weren't used to seeing back in Denmark, we began to step back. I noticed the bear didn't seem too interested in us, so cautiously and slowly, we trekked back towards where we came from, but as I said before, we did not pay enough attention to where we were going. Basically, we were a bit lost. The panic began to set in before long. We went around and around in those woods for what seemed like hours. What we didn't know was that the bear we encountered had decided to follow us the entire time. As soon as we realized we were being tracked, we became extremely scared. It was at that point we looked at each other and nodded our heads and began to run, despite the warnings we've heard from people before. We only looked back on occasion to see if the bear was closing in. I couldn't stop thinking about how I was going to die in some godforsaken woods a long way from home. Then two extremely loud pops ring out through the air. It was a hunter sitting in a tree on his platform. We stopped then, catching our breaths. The hunter comes down, telling us how lucky we were that he saw us in the distance running from a bear who was right on our trail. To think we had been that close to being eaten. We explained the whole story on how we got lost. Then he led us back on the right path to our camp. I never got his name, but to dear Mr. Hunter, thank you for saving our lives. Thank you for listening to another unsettling episode of Unexplained Encounters. You can send us your story to have it narrated on the show at darkstories.org. Unexplained Encounters is an EerieCast original series. You can find other horror-themed podcasts at EerieCast.com, such as Redwood Bureau, a fictional anthology series, Freaky Folklore, a documentary-style series about myths and cryptids around the world, Destination Terror, a show about the most haunted places, and Tales from the Break Room, another show I host all about the scary things that happen to people at work. Again, that's EerieCast.com. By the way, if you want fewer annoying ads and you want to support what we do, consider going to EerieCast.com/plus to sign up for EerieCast Plus. That unlocks all our podcasts with all but host-read ads removed. Until next time, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one. My God, get ready, because this story scared even me. It almost made me regret living in the Ozarks. This story is titled Box Fan and was sent to me by a viewer named simply Jeb. In it, He recalls a series of bizarre childhood rules and events at his grandparents' mountain home in the Ozarks, which ultimately led to the most traumatic moment in his life, the moment he realized monsters are real. This is the Unexplained Encounters podcast. I sleep with the fan on every single night, regardless of the reason, no matter the temperature. A box fan runs on the floor next to my bed at full speed. My wife thinks it's a white noise thing, something to help me sleep. She's gotten used to it over the years. She bought me one of those sound machines for Christmas a couple years back. It plays ocean waves and rain and all that stuff, and I thanked her. But I put it in the closet and kept on using the fan. She never asked why, but I'm sure she wondered. I think she could tell by my face that I didn't want to explain. I'm 34 years old. I've slept with a box fan on since I was 11, and I'll probably sleep with one on until the day I die. This is not a comfort thing. At least, not in the way you expect. I've never told anyone the full version of what I'm about to write down. Not even my wife. I've explained parts, yeah, like during a particularly bad night terror that had me standing in the hallway at 3 a.m. with my hands against the wall, like I was bracing for something to hit the house, and my wife found me there, asking what I'd been dreaming about. I didn't remember, I said, but that was a lie. Not too long ago, my grandfather passed away. He was 91 years old, lived a full life, and had been in a wheelchair for the last 12 years. A stroke had taken most of his left side. At the funeral, I was standing by the coffee and those little crustless sandwiches that only exist at church receptions when my cousin Parker walked up, and without any preamble or greeting, he leaned in and said, "You remember that night?" It wasn't a question, and I didn't treat it like one. I simply nodded, and we stood still for a while, until his wife called him over to deal with one of his kids, and that was it. We haven't talked about it since. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't shake something loose. So here it is. My grandfather owned 130 acres in the Ozarks, most of it backed up to Mark Twain National Forest land, in a part of southern Missouri where the nearest grocery store was a 40-minute drive, and the nearest hospital was further than that. He had retired from the Missouri Pacific Railroad before I was born, and he spent his days doing whatever he wanted on that land, which mostly meant tinkering with small engines and sitting on his porch, growing tomatoes that he'd give away to anyone who stopped by. He was no farmer, though people sometimes assumed he was. He just had land, and he liked having it, and he kept it the way some men keep their guns, maintained and ready, though ready for what was never entirely clear to me as a child. The house was old but solid. He and my grandmother had built it in 1961 with money he'd saved from the railroad, and it looked like what it was. A post-war rural home designed by people who valued function but had a limited interest in aesthetics. Single-story, partial basement, wood-paneled walls inside that had darkened over the decades to the color of strong tea. It smelled of coffee grounds and something chemically that I eventually identified as mothballs, which were stuffed into the closets. The porch wrapped around two sides and had a concrete floor that was always gritty underfoot. There were 2 rocking chairs out there that had worn smooth grooves into the concrete from decades of use. The property itself was mostly open yard around the house, maybe 2 acres of mowed grass, then the tree line on 3 sides. The 4th side was the gravel driveway, a quarter-mile of loose rock that popped under tires and announced every arrival long before you could see the vehicle. Beyond the driveway was just more trees. A barn sat about 200 yards from the house, listing to the south. It had stayed like that for as long as I'd been alive. as though it had decided 30 years ago how far it was willing to lean and had just committed to it. There was a creek that cut through the back portion of the property, where the woods thickened up, and in the summer it ran shallow enough to wade in, and deep enough in a few spots to sit down in up to your chest. Every summer, my parents sent me and my cousins out there for 2 or 3 weeks. Parker was 2 years older than me, fearless in a stupid way, and I say that with the most love possible. Leia was my age, quiet, and loved reading books more than anything. Sometimes baby Derek would come too. He was Aunt Diane's youngest, maybe 4 or 5 years old during the years I'm talking about, but he was mostly just a background presence, trailing after the rest of us and crying when he couldn't keep up. During the day, that property was the best place on earth. I genuinely believed that. We had the run of the entire 100+ acres, and we used every inch of it. I remember catching crawdads in the creek with our bare hands, racing them on the flat rocks. We explored that barn hundreds of times, which was full of old equipment and barn swallows, and rusty junk that felt like pirate treasure to a 9-year-old. Grandpa even had an old 3-wheeler ATV. Yeah, if you didn't know, you could get a 3-wheeler back then. They were a bit more common than what you might see today, because they were soon considered way too dangerous. But back then he would let Parker drive it around the property while the rest of us clung to the back like it was a mechanical bull. Grandma kept a drawer in the kitchen full of candy too. Off-brand candy though, mostly. Most of it being butterscotch discs and peppermints. But occasionally, if you're lucky, there would be Snickers in there, hidden away specifically for the kids. Those really were the good days. I want to be clear about that. Those days were genuinely wonderful. It was the nights that were different. I've spent a long time trying to articulate exactly how the shift happened each evening, and the best I can describe it is that my grandfather had an internal clock that the rest of us could not see or hear, and around 5 or 6 o'clock every day, it would go off, and he would become a different person. Now hold on there, he didn't get mean, he didn't yell or become harsh. He just sort of went somewhere else inside himself. You could see it in the way he moved. He would straighten up from whatever he was doing, and his eyes would go to the sky like he was reading something written up there in a language meant just for him. His jaw would start to clench repeatedly, and then he would herd all the kids inside. The rule was that we had to be in the house before the first star appeared in the sky. Not before sunset, which would have been reasonable, but before the first star. In June in Missouri, the sun doesn't fully set until around 9 o'clock, but the first stars can show up in the east while the western sky is still pale. And Grandpa knew this. He watched for them every night with a patience that bordered on obsession. He would sit on the porch in his rocking chair and face east, just waiting. And the moment he saw that first pinpoint of light, wherever we were on the property, he wanted us inside. If we were down at the creek, he'd ring the iron bell mounted on the porch post. A real cast iron bell, too, the kind you would see at old schoolhouses, and you could hear it across the entire property. That sound meant now. It did not mean start heading back. It didn't mean get an attitude or argue. It meant get your butt inside. Once inside, the house changed too. Grandpa would go room to room pulling down the blinds, and these were not typical blinds. Every window in that house had thick, opaque roller shades, the heavy kind that you might find in a dark room or a hospital room where a patient needed total darkness. They were mounted inside the window frames, and when you pulled them down, they sealed the glass almost completely. No light got in, and I suppose more importantly, no light got out. He pulled every single one of them down every single night, without exception, and we were not allowed to raise them or peek behind them until morning. He never explained why. It was simply the rule. And in that house, his rules had the weight of physics. You didn't question gravity, and you didn't question Grandpa. The doors were another thing. He had a deadbolt on every exterior door, which, for a rural house in the middle of nowhere, was already unusual. But the front door also had a chain lock and a sliding barrel bolt that he had installed himself, a heavy steel piece that seated into a bracket that he had lag bolted directly onto the door frame. Every night, I'd hear him making his rounds. The back door first, then the side door off the kitchen, then the front. Click, click, thunk, slide. The same order every time. The sounds of the house being sealed. And then there were the fans. Every bedroom had a box fan. The cheap kind you could grab at a hardware store for $12 or so, with plastic blades and a rattling motor, and 3 speed settings that were basically loud, louder, and broken sounding. In the room where the kids slept, a guest room with 2 twin beds and a folding cot, Grandpa would set the fan on a wooden chair between the beds and turn it on high before we went to bed. It roared. It pushed air around that didn't need pushing. The house did have central air conditioning that worked fine. The fan would dry out your eyes and your throat so that by morning you'd wake up feeling like you slept in a kiln. Parker hated it and complained about it every summer. Leia slept with a pillow over her face to block the wind. I would just pull the sheet up to my nose and breathed through the fabric, and I dealt with it. One summer, Parker asked Grandma directly why we had to sleep with the fans on. She said the house got stuffy at night and the fans helped circulate the air. Parker pointed out that the air conditioning was literally running, and Grandma gave him a look that was pleasant on the surface, but had something underneath it. Something that communicated very clearly that this line of questioning was finished. Then she said, "Your grandpa likes the fans on, so the fans stay on." And that they did. I understand now what the fans were for. I've understood this since I was 11. The fans were loud enough to cover the sounds from outside. Almost. That was their entire purpose. They were there so it was harder to hear what was walking around the house at night. I should tell you about the moon. There's a specific memory I keep coming back to, from a summer when I was 8 or maybe 9 years old. I was sitting on the porch with Grandpa after dinner while the sky was doing its long summer fade from orange to purple, and the moon was rising in the east, enormous and nearly full, a deep amber color. I said something about it, like, "Look at that moon," or maybe, "The moon's huge tonight." At first, I didn't think my grandpa was going to say anything. He rocked in his chair and looked at the moon, and he didn't look happy about it, like I was. Eventually, he said to me, as if I wasn't even there, "I hate that damned thing." I thought he was joking around. I even laughed, but it came out awkward and forced. He didn't laugh. Over the years, I started to notice a pattern without fully understanding it. Grandpa was worse on certain nights, and it took me a long time to connect those nights to the moon because I was a kid and I wasn't tracking lunar cycles for fun. But looking back, the pattern was unmistakable. On nights when the moon was full, he was tense and vigilant, more alert than usual and more watchful, up later than Grandma. On nights where there was no moon at all, when the sky was just a black field of stars with no light to speak of, he was something else entirely. He was afraid. I don't think I had a word for it when I was young, but that's what it was. On moonless nights, my grandfather was a man in the grip of a real, grinding fear. He would check the locks more than once. He'd sit in the living room long after everyone else went to bed. And come morning, he would look gray and hollowed out, like someone who had spent the night awake and watching for something that might or might not come. Some nights, despite that fan, I could hear things. The fan covered a lot, yes, but it didn't cover everything. And on certain nights, there were footsteps outside that house. They were slow footsteps pacing around, like someone circling something else, taking their time. It would move along one side of the house, pause, sometimes right outside our bedroom window. A pause long enough that I'd be holding my breath in bed, eyes open, seeing nothing because of those blackout blinds, thankfully. and then continue on around the next side. When I mentioned it at breakfast once, doing my best to sound casual about it, Grandma would smile and said that Grandpa had trouble sleeping and he liked to walk the property at night. Said he was checking the animals in the barn to make sure nothing was getting into the feed. Parker, who was old enough by then to hear an explanation and measure it against what he actually believed, asked what exactly Grandpa was searching or checking for. Grandma changed the subject so smoothly, it was almost a magic trick, and before we knew it, we were talking about what we wanted for lunch. One night, I remember getting up to use the bathroom. I think I was 10 years old. The hallway was dark and the bathroom was on the far side of the living room, which meant I had to walk through the main part of the house to get there. As I passed through the living room, I stopped. Grandpa was in his recliner. The TV was off. Every light in the house was off. He was sitting perfectly upright with his deer rifle laid across his thighs, and his eyes were open, and he was staring at the front door. He didn't look at me. He didn't move. He did not acknowledge me in any way. He sat there like a man who had been sitting there for hours, and intended to sit there for hours more, watching that door with deadly focus, as if he expected it, or prayed that it wouldn't open. I went back to bed, and I listened to the fan and the footsteps outside, and I did not go back to sleep for a long time. The last thing I need to mention before I get to the rest of this is the basement. During the day, the basement was fair game. It was an unfinished space with concrete floor, cinder block walls, exposed ceiling joints, and it held the washer and dryer, a bunch of storage shelves, and a workbench Grandpa used for small projects. It had these narrow slit windows that sit at ground level from the outside, wider than they are tall, hinged at the top so they could swing inward for ventilation. During the day, Grandpa sometimes propped them up to air out the place. After dark, the basement, though, was off limits, and the way Grandpa communicated this was different from his other rules. Those other rules, the blinds, the fans, the inside before stars rule, those were enforced through routine. He just did them and you fell in line because that's how things worked. The basement rule was the only one he ever stated out loud, directly, looking right at us. He said, "You do not go in that basement after the sun goes down." And his face when he said it was not the face of a man setting a household boundary, but rather someone telling you not to put your hand into a running engine. He was not making a rule as much as he was describing a very real danger. For years, that's what summers were. The days were creek water and crawdads and the smell of cut grass and Grandma's fantastic cooking. But the nights were blackout blinds, locked doors, the drone of a box fan drowning out whatever moved in the dark outside. I accepted all of this. I was a kid. It was part of my world. Like Santa Claus, you accepted these kinds of things without analysis. This was Grandpa's house, and these were Grandpa's rules, and the world at Grandpa's house simply worked differently than it did at home. So I never really questioned it, and I followed every rule to the letter, right up until the summer I turned 11. That was the summer Grandpa had his stroke, when the rules came apart, and I finally truly learned what all of it had been for. Now, I know I said the last thing I would mention before the real story would be the basement thing, but there is one more thing I need to tell you before I get to what happened the summer I was 11. This is the story my grandfather told me on the porch. I was around 9 or 10. It was a full moon night. I remember that because the moon was the reason I was outside at all. I couldn't sleep despite the fan, or maybe because of it. My throat felt like sandpaper and I needed some water. When I padded out to the kitchen to get some, I could see through the gap at the bottom of the living room blinds. The porch was lit up silver white, bright enough to read by, and the front door was open to the screen. Obviously, this was all very bizarre. Grandpa never left doors open at night, never had the blinds in a way we could peek through them. But there he was on the other side of the screen door, sitting in his rocker with the rifle across his knees, staring out at the yard and the tree line beyond it in all that cold moonlight. I pushed open the screen door and he looked at me. I expected him to tell me to go back to bed right away, but he didn't do that. He looked very tired. In fact, I'd never seen him so tired. And I want to say it wasn't like a sleepy kind of tired either. The man looked absolutely worn through, a tiredness that went beyond muscles. He studied me for a second, then he tipped his head toward the other rocking chair. I sat down in it with my feet dangling, because I was too short to reach the concrete. We sat there for a while without talking. The moon was so bright it threw hard shadows across the yard, and the tree line at the edge of the mowed grass looked like a wall someone had built out of pure blackness, but then backlit it from the inside with pale gray where the moonlight caught the upper canopy. It was beautiful enough to take your breath away. Every few seconds a bat would cut through the light above the yard, there and gone so quick it was like a glitch in your vision. Then Grandpa began to talk. He didn't look at me when he did, and he didn't raise his voice above a low murmur. It really looked like he was talking to himself rather than to me. He told me a story, and I'm going to relay it here the way I can remember it, which means it might have gaps or rough edges, because I was a child then when I heard it, and he was not a man who knew how to tell a story in any organized fashion. He was blunt and sparse, with a lot left out that he either assumed you'd fill in or preferred you didn't. So here goes. When my grandfather was young, 20 or 21, he said, something had started getting into the livestock on the properties around his family's land. His father, my great-grandfather, raised cattle, and a few of the neighboring families had cattle or hogs or both. Over the span of maybe a month, animals started to turn up dead in the fields and pens, and from the way Grandpa described it, dead was putting it generously. He said the animals were taken apart. He used that phrase specifically. Taken apart. Like a mechanic taking apart an engine. Pieces here, pieces there. Organs separated from the body and moved to places they shouldn't be. He said one of the neighbor's heifers was found with its rib cage opened up and emptied out, with the contents arranged in the grass beside it, in what he called a kind of order, though he wouldn't say what that meant, and I wasn't asking. I remember thinking, how is he telling a kid my age all of this? But he kept going. The initial assumption was dogs. Feral dogs were a real problem in that part of the Ozarks. Packs of them could form up out of strays and dumped pets. They could bring down a calf if they were hungry and numerous enough. But the men who looked at the remains said it wasn't dogs, and it wasn't coyotes either. Because dogs and coyotes are messy, frantic killers that tear into whatever they can reach and leave a scattered wreck. Whatever was doing this, it was doing it with a kind of deliberateness, and that did not match any predator that they knew of. Grandpa said his father came back from examining one of the kills and sat at the kitchen table, completely silent. When Grandpa's mother asked him what was wrong, he simply said, "Something's pulling them apart with its hands." Now, nobody called the game warden or the sheriff. This was the rural Ozarks in the early 1950s. These men solved their own problems. My great-grandfather organized a hunt. He put the word out to the surrounding families. Grandpa's Uncle Earl, 2 men from the next property over whose names I've long forgotten, or maybe I never knew, and a cousin of some kind, who I think was only there mostly because he owned dogs that had been used for tracking boar. In total, there were 5, maybe 6 men, including my grandfather, who was the youngest at the time, and was allowed to come because he owned a rifle too, and knew how to use it, and because his father was not the kind of man you argued with successfully. They went out on a night when the livestock killings had been at their worst. Grandpa said they waited for the moon to be up so they'd have light. They brought rifles and lanterns and the tracking dogs, 2 of them, big bony hounds with scarred-up ears, and they went into the trees behind my great-grandfather's property at around 10 o'clock at night. Grandpa told me about this part of the hunt in pieces, and some of what he said I've had to reconstruct from what I remember, and what makes sense in context. Because, like I said, he was not a natural storyteller, and I was a kid, sitting in the dark, trying to follow an old man's fragmented account of something that happened 40 years before I was born. The dogs lasted about an hour. They went in eager, excited hounds with a scent to follow, heads down and pulling against their leads. But then they stopped, both of them, at nearly the same time. They froze where they stood and began shaking. Grandpa said one of them urinated on itself. They refused to move forward, and they refused to stay quiet. They started to make a sound that he described as a continuous whine, high and thin. Not a game call, but something from when it's gone beyond fear into a place where its brain had stopped working properly. One of the dogs ripped free of its lead and bolted off. They heard it crashing through the underbrush for about 30 seconds, and then the sound faded and they never found that dog. The remaining hound pressed itself against its owner's legs and had to be dragged along for the rest of the night, like a piece of furniture. So after the dogs became useless, the men kept going on their own. They were deep in the timber by this point, in that old-growth Ozark woodland where the canopy closes overhead and the moonlight comes through in patches. Everything between those patches is ink dark. Grandpa said they could hear something moving in the trees around them. He was specific about this part. He said it wasn't moving through the underbrush like a deer or a boar would, pushing through branches at ground level. It was moving above them, in the canopy. He said they could hear branches creaking and snapping up high, the sound of something heavy transferring its weight from limb to limb, and it was fast, much faster than walking pace. He said it circled them for a while, up there in the dark above the lantern light, and the sound of it was like a man running on all fours across treetops, which is an image I've never been able to get out of my head, even though I heard this sitting on a porch 20-some years ago. They kept moving because they were men who had committed to doing something, and because turning back now would have meant walking through the same stretch of forest they had just come through, and whatever was pacing them in the canopy would have still been there. Grandpa said they walked for maybe another half hour, with the sound above them coming and going, sometimes close enough that debris would fall on them, small twigs and bark and pieces of leaf. Other times far enough away that they nearly convinced themselves it had gone. The remaining dog had given up walking entirely and was being carried by its owner. Then, the thing came down out of the trees. Grandpa didn't describe this like a dramatic moment. He said it matter-of-factly, like someone saying, "It started to rain." The crashing above them stopped, and there was a heavy sound about 40 yards ahead of them, like something landing on the ground from a great height. Then, silence. It was Uncle Earl who saw it first. Earl was at the front of the group, a few paces ahead of the others, carrying a lantern in one hand and his rifle in the other. He stopped walking and said very low without turning around, "It's standing up." Grandpa raised his lantern. At the far edge of the light, about 30 yards out where the glow gave way to solid dark, he could see a shape between 2 trees. He said it was tall, taller than any of them, and Earl was over 6 feet. It was standing on 2 legs and it was perfectly still. The lantern light was too weak at that distance to give him anything more than an outline, but he said the outline was enough. He said it looked like someone had taken the general idea of a person and built it after stretching the measurements. He said the head set forward on the neck, reminding him more of a vulture, with a long-looking snout or perhaps a nose, and its shoulders were enormous, far too wide for the head they supported. The arms hung past where arms should stop. Then it dropped forward onto all fours, and it was gone. The sound of its movement exploded back into the canopy above them, crashing through the branches heading north, fast and getting farther away. The men stood there in a circle of lantern light with their rifles up, and nobody said anything for what Grandpa estimated was about 2 full minutes. They should have gone home. They all knew that. But they didn't, because Uncle Earl said the thing was heading toward the Dawson property, where cattle had been killed the week prior. And because these were Ozark men in the 1950s, and going home would have been something they'd have to live with for a long time, they followed. The timber got worse as they went north. The terrain broke up into ridges and draws and rocky shelves where the footing was bad even in daylight, and the men started to spread out because you couldn't walk 6 abreast through that kind of country. They kept in contact by calling to each other. Grandpa said his father would shout, and the others would shout back, a kind of roll call every few minutes to make sure nobody had fallen or gotten turned around. The thing in the canopy had gone quiet, or at least they couldn't hear it over the sound of their own movement across the rough ground. Suddenly, there was a gunshot, a single sharp crack that bounced off the ridge walls and came from the east, from Uncle Earl's direction, because Earl had drifted the furthest from the group. Grandpa said everyone stopped where they were, and in the silence after the shot, they heard Earl screaming. He was far enough away that the sound was thin and echoing and hard to locate precisely. But it was unmistakably a man screaming in a register that Grandpa said he'd never heard from a grown person before, and never heard again after. Then there was a second shot, which cut off the screaming. Then nothing. Just the trees in the dark, and all of them standing in it. For some time, Grandpa went quiet after he told me that part. He rocked in his chair and looked at the moon, and his hands were still on the rifle across his lap. I could see that even decades later, the memory of that silence after the second shot was costing him something to sit with. I waited because even at 9 or 10, I understood that you don't interrupt a man when he's in a place like that. When he started again, his voice was flatter. He said they'd found Earl's rifle at the bottom of a draw, wedged between 2 rocks. It had been fired twice, both rounds spent. There was blood on the rocks and on the ground, a lot of it, and there were drag marks leading down into a ravine so choked with brush and fallen timber that they couldn't push through it in the dark. They stood at the edge of that ravine, calling Earl's name until the sky started to lighten up in the east. My grandfather didn't tell me what they found when they went back in daylight. He said, "They told his wife it was an animal attack." I noticed that phrasing even then, young as I was. They told her. He didn't say it was an animal attack. He told me what they told her it was, and the gap between those two things was wide enough to fall into. The official family story, the one I'd heard at Thanksgiving tables and funerals my whole life, without knowing it had any connection to my grandfather's property, was that Earl had died in a hunting accident, had shot himself, and by the time the search party had reached him, animals had gotten to the remains. A tragedy, but the kind of tragedy that happened in the rural Ozarks. People accepted it, because it was the kind of thing that could be accepted. Grandpa sat with me for a while longer after he finished. The moon had moved since he'd started talking, and the shadows in the yard had shifted with it. The tree line looked different than before. Not to say it was menacing, exactly, but more aware. Like when you walk in a room and you didn't know that someone was in there, and they never announce themselves. You simply see them suddenly. Eventually, he looked at me, and his eyes were clear and direct. He said, There's something in those woods that doesn't have a name, and it's smarter than you want it to be. That's why we have the rules. You understand?" I nodded. "The worst nights are the new moons," he said. "On a full moon, you can see it coming. On a new moon, it can see you, and you can't see a thing." He told me to go back to bed then, and I went. I pulled the sheet up to my nose, and I listened to the box fan roar. But I did not go back to sleep that night. In the morning, I looked out the window at the tree line in the early sunlight. It was just trees, the very same trees I'd played under the day before. But now they meant something completely different. After that night on the porch, I never doubted or wondered about the rules again. I would pull the blinds down myself, turn the fan on before anyone told me to, and I would be the first inside before the first star even showed, every single time without being asked. The footsteps outside some nights that Grandma said were Grandpa checking on the animals. I knew what those were now. My grandfather was not inspecting the barn. Grandpa wasn't even outside. Something in those woods had taken my grandfather's uncle apart in a ravine 40 years ago, and it was still here. I understood the rules. I followed the rules. And those rules kept us safe every summer of my childhood, until the summer my grandfather collapsed in his kitchen with a mug of coffee shattering on the linoleum and the left side of his body going slack. Suddenly, the only person who truly knew what the rules were for was unconscious and driven to a hospital. Grandpa's stroke happened one morning in the middle of our second week during that stay. He was standing at the counter pouring coffee from the percolator, the same thing he did every morning at the same time, and his left hand simply opened on its own and let the mug fall. It hit the floor, breaking into 3 pieces, and coffee went everywhere. Grandpa looked down at it, then looked at Grandma, and said, "Joyce, there's something wrong with my arm." Then he sat down in a kitchen chair heavily, like someone had increased the gravity in the room, and the left side of his face slid downward and stayed there. Grandma called 911. She called Aunt Diane too, who lived 4 hours away in the suburbs outside St. Louis. Then she did what she could, which was to hold Grandpa's right hand and talk to him in a steady voice while the 3 of us stood in the kitchen doorway, watching, not knowing what to do with ourselves. I remember that the ambulance took a long time to get there. That's how far out we were from anything. They loaded Grandpa onto a stretcher. He looked so small and frail. I remember thinking that my grandpa might die, and I was scared. This man, who had been the largest presence in every room he ever entered, now looked like a gray-faced old man with only one working hand. Grandma couldn't go with him, not until Aunt Diane came, and once Aunt Diane showed up, Grandma left in a hurry. I remember just after she left, looking at the blinds on the windows, thinking that no one in this house would know to pull them down, and why. Aunt Diane and her husband Cal arrived around 3 in the afternoon, hugging Grandma and wishing her and Grandpa the best as she left. Aunt Diane was Grandpa's youngest daughter, a very sweet woman with a loud laugh who worked as an office manager somewhere. She drove a minivan and had probably not spent a full night in this house in 15 years. Uncle Cal was fine, a big, soft-spoken guy who sold insurance and was decent with kids. He gave lots of those cheesy kid compliments and high fives, like, "Good job, sport," that kind of thing. They were the kind of adults you'd want around during a family emergency, for sure. Warm and capable. Aunt Diane spent most of the evening on the phone with the hospital and with other relatives, leading a sort of crisis management with the family. Uncle Cal ordered pizza from the one place that would actually deliver that far out, which took over an hour. He even let us eat it in the living room in front of the TV, which Grandma never allowed. That first evening, I kept waiting for someone to start the routine, hoping someone was watching the sky and would call us inside if we were outside, or go room to room with the blinds, setting up fans, locking doors. But nobody did. The sun went down and the windows stayed uncovered, and the doors stayed latched with their regular locks, not with the deadbolts. No chain, no barrel bolt, nothing. The fans stayed in the closet where Grandma stored them during the day. That house felt utterly naked, like a body without skin. Everything that was supposed to be protected was now open and exposed to whatever was out there. I almost said something. I stood in the hallway and rehearsed it in my head. Something about how Grandpa liked the blinds down and the fans on. Something casual that wouldn't require me to explain why. But I couldn't figure out how to say it without sounding strange. I was 11 years old, but the weight of adult attention during a crisis was paralyzing, so I didn't say anything. I went to bed in the guest room with Parker and Leia. The window was uncovered, and the fan was off. I lay there in the most awkward silence, so enormous and wrong, I could hear my own heartbeat. I slept eventually. The following day was almost normal. Uncle Cal took us outside. We rode the three-wheeler and threw rocks in the creek, and Aunt Diane drove to the hospital, coming back in the late afternoon with a cautiously optimistic report. Grandpa was stable, responsive, but they were keeping him for observation and tests. There was also talk of moving him to a larger facility in Springfield. She looked exhausted. Uncle Cal made spaghetti for dinner. It was watery and undersalted, but we all ate it. Nobody had the energy to care about food quality at the time. That evening, Parker pulled me and Leia aside in the hallway. I could tell he was being very sneaky about something. "They don't care what we do," he said, meaning Aunt Diane and Uncle Cal, who were back on the phone in the master bedroom with the door mostly shut. "We should stay outside tonight, after dark. We're never going to get that chance again." Leia looked at me. I could tell she wanted me to say no so she wouldn't have to. And I nearly did. But Parker was 13 and I was 11. At that age, that's a big gap. And some part of me, the side that was tired of being so afraid every summer, tired of the fans and the blinds and the locked down feeling of Grandpa's nighttime house, that side wanted to know what the property was like after dark. I'd spent years sealed inside while the world outside continued without me, and I wanted to see it. So I said okay, and Leia said okay because I had, and Parker grinned. We went out the back door at around 8:30, with the sky still holding on to the last orange glow in the west, but the east had already gone to deep blue. The very first thing that struck me was how different the property sounded at night. The creek, which was a pleasant background murmur during the day, was loud, more present, so to speak, in the dark, even aggressive sounding. The bugs were deafening, a whole wall of sound from every direction, cicadas and crickets and tree frogs layering over each other in a pulsing roar that seemed to breathe. And underneath all that was the woods. The tree line was about 60 yards from where we stood at the back of the house, and in the dying light, it looked solid, a dark mass without depth or detail. We had flashlights, 2 of them, from the kitchen junk drawer, but both were so weak that they barely reached 20 feet. Parker swept his across the yard like a searchlight. It revealed a narrow cone of grass and bugs, but nothing more. Beyond that cone was just more dark. He started to walk toward the tree line. Leia and I followed, too scared to be away from our oldest member. For about 20 minutes, it was what Parker had promised, an adventure. We walked along the edge of the trees without going in, shining our flashlights into the first few yards of timber, seeing trunks and underbrush. Occasionally, we found a pair of tiny reflective eyes, probably belonging to some small or low-to-the-ground raccoon or possum. Parker kept up a running commentary during this, about how this wasn't even scary, and that Grandpa's rules were just an old man being paranoid. I let him say those things because I simply didn't know what to say, and I liked the lack of silence. Suddenly, Leia stopped. She was slightly behind me and to my left. When I turned around, she was standing very still with her flashlight pointed at the tree line, about 40 yards south of where we were. Her flashlight was weak, and it barely reached the trees at that distance. But at the very edge of its throw, where the light gave up and the dark took over again, there was a shape between two trunks that I could not make sense of. It was taller than any of us by a significant margin. It was also narrow, standing on two legs, but it was completely motionless. The flashlight was much too dim to give any texture or color, so it remained a silhouette, a vertical interruption in the pattern of the trees behind it, and it was facing us. "Something standing there," Leia said. Her voice was perfectly calm. Parker swung his flashlight toward it. For half a second, both beams hit roughly the same area, and in that combined light, I saw, or I thought I saw, the shape shift, a sudden movement, quickly, like something rearranging its posture. Leia's light flickered then. These were cheap, battery-powered flashlights. In that half-second of reduced light, the shape was gone. Just trees. Just ordinary dark between tree trunks. Parker said it was a deer. He said it with enough conviction that I knew he didn't believe it. And I think Leia knew too, because she was already walking toward the house, and she was walking fast. We followed her, and how we kept from actually full-on running, I have no idea. Perhaps we were too scared to run, but we walked at a pace that was as close to running as you could get. And when we made it to the back door and went inside, shutting it behind us, Parker locked the knob lock and then stood there looking at the deadbolt above it. He looks at us, then half laughs, saying, "It'll be fine." So we left it unlocked, and we didn't say anything else about it. We stood in the kitchen, breathing harder than the walk justified, and Parker then said, "That was fun." But Leia and I stayed quiet. He then said, "We should sleep down in the basement tonight." I felt my stomach drop when he said it. The basement was the other role, the one Grandpa had spoken out loud with his eyes locked on mine, and hearing Parker propose breaking it felt like hearing someone suggest swimming in a river during a storm. But Parker was already talking about it like it was decided. He'd seen the old Nintendo down there, he said, when Aunt Diane had gone down to do laundry earlier. And there were games, and probably other stuff. And the basement was cool, and it would be like a fort. And he reiterated, when would we get another chance? I looked at Leia. She had her arms crossed over her chest, and she was staring at the floor. We were both wondering the same thing, I think. How much resistance was worth the cost of Parker's ridicule? She must have arrived at the same answer I did, because she shrugged one shoulder and said, "Whatever." And Parker took that as unanimous consent and started gathering supplies. We brought sleeping bags and pillows from the guest room. Parker grabbed a bag of chips and 3 cans of Coke from the fridge. Leia brought a book, which was optimistic. We trooped down the wooden stairs into the basement, and Parker pulled the chain on the single bare bulb at the bottom. The room came to life in harsh yellowish light. Everything else was concrete and shadow. Honestly, for a few hours, though, it was great. Parker found the NES under the workbench, still connected to a small TV that must have been old when Reagan was president, and after 20 minutes of blowing into cartridges and fiddling with the AV cables, he got it to work. We played Excitebike, then Duck Hunt without the light gun, just using the controller, which didn't work perfectly, but we didn't mind. Leia found a stack of board games on a shelf. Sorry and Clue and something called Aggravation that none of us had ever heard of. We played Clue on the concrete floor with the chips and soda spread around us, like we were having a picnic. Parker discovered a cabinet near the water heater that contained, among other things, a collection of candy so old that some of it was in packaging I didn't recognize. We tried a few pieces. They tasted like sweetened chalk. We ate them anyway, because adventure was the whole point. Really, it was the most fun I'd had at that house in years, maybe ever. We were loud and stupid and free, and Aunt Diane and Uncle Cal never came down to check on us. For those few hours, the basement was just a basement, and the rules we were used to, they were just the eccentricities of an old man who was currently in a hospital bed 40 minutes away with tubes in his arm. We fell asleep in stages. Leia went first. She had set up her sleeping bag near the base of the stairs and was out cold by midnight. Parker lasted a little longer on the sagging couch against the far wall, talking to me about a girl from his school, while his sentences got slower and more fragmented, until they stopped entirely, and his breathing evened out. I lay in my sleeping bag in the middle of the floor. I was between the two of them, looking up at the ceiling joists and the cobwebs, listening to the silence. No fan, just silence. I hadn't really thought about that part until that very moment. I'd been distracted by the games and the food and the novelty of it all. But lying there in the dark after Parker killed the light, the silence of that basement was absolute. No fan roar to fill the space, and no white noise to blur the edges of whatever sounds the night might be making. There was, though, the faint ticking of the water heater, and the even fainter hum of the electrical panel on the wall. But beyond that, nothing. I listened to my cousin's breathing. It was so dark and so quiet. It felt like I was deep, deep underwater. Eventually, and I don't know when, I fell asleep. But when I woke up, I was very cold. Genuinely cold. A damp chill had gotten through the sleeping bag and into my skin. It made no sense because it was July in Missouri, and the basement had been stuffy and warm when we'd come down. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around myself. That's when I felt the draft. Moving air coming from somewhere to my left, carrying a smell that did not belong in that basement. The green, wet smell of outside, of grass and dirt and night air, and underneath it was something else. A warm and sour and biological smell. It reminded me of a dog's breath, but heavier and denser, more concentrated. One of the slit windows was open. I couldn't see it. The dark in that basement was the most complete dark I'd ever experienced, where open and closed eyes were the same thing. But I could feel the outside air coming through it. I could feel that the air was wrong, that it carried the heat and smell of something that was not the night. And every hair on my body stood up at once. I heard it before I could even make sense of it. Breathing. Low and wet, raspy on the exhale. A large animal trying to keep quiet. Something was in the room with us. Something was inside the basement. And it was breathing. It was close. I stopped moving, and I stopped breathing. Every muscle in my body locked into a rigid, frozen state that I did not choose and could not have overridden if I'd tried. My higher brain, the part that reasons and plans and makes decisions, had been disconnected from the controls entirely, and what was running me now was something much older, much simpler. Something that said to me, "You must not move. You must not breathe. You must no longer exist." The breathing shifted. It moved through the room, slowly, with a carefulness that was worse than speed, because speed would mean a panicked animal, and this was not panicked. It was methodical. And beneath that breathing, accompanying it, I heard the footsteps, a light, clicking, tapping cadence on the concrete floor. The sound of something with claws, walking on a hard surface. And the rhythm. It didn't match anything that walks on two legs, but it didn't quite match anything that walks on four. The sound of it moving across the concrete floor in the perfect dark was the most alien and dislocating thing I've ever heard. It moved past me, close enough that I could feel warmth coming off of it, the radiant body heat of something large and very alive, and I caught a wave of that smell, that sour, biological, overly wet dog smell. But up close, it was sharper, and there was more underneath it, something that reminded me of blood. It passed within what had to be 2 or 3 feet of my sleeping bag, and I lay there with my eyes wide open in the dark, and I saw absolutely nothing. I felt it go by me, like a weather system. Then it stopped, near the couch where Parker had been sleeping. I heard the breathing change then, faster, shorter, with a sniffing quality, like it was sampling the air around him. Then it moved again, toward the stairs, toward Leia. It stopped. The breathing was maybe 4 feet from my head, 4 feet from Leia's sleeping bag at the base of the stairs. I could hear her slow, unconscious breathing, and the thing's breathing layered over it, and for a span of time that I cannot accurately estimate. Was it 5 seconds, 30, a full minute? Those were the only sounds in the world. Then the thing made a sound, a low and soft sound from deep in its chest, barely louder than the breathing. It wasn't a growl, and it wasn't a whine. It sat somewhere between the two, carrying an emotion I should not have been able to read, but I could. It was interested. Whatever was standing over my cousin in the dark was curious about her. Leia shifted in her sleeping bag, a small unconscious movement, the kind of half-roll that sleeping people do, and she made a sound, a murmur, maybe a fragment of a dream, nothing coherent. But then her eyes opened. No, I couldn't see it. I knew because she spoke then. Her voice was muzzy and confused and half asleep, and I heard her say, "Is that a dog? Who let a—" The rest of her sentence was replaced by a sound that I will hear for the rest of my life. A sudden detonation of movement, claws scrabbling on concrete, a heavy, wet impact of a body hitting the sleeping bag, and the sound of the bag being seized and wrenched sideways across the floor so quickly that Leia's confused question turned into a scream that did not sound like language or even a human voice anymore. Just a raw and primal shriek of an animal in terror. It bounced off the concrete walls, filling the basement from floor to ceiling. I heard the sleeping bag dragging, fast, impossibly fast, scraping across the concrete toward the far wall where the open window was. Trust me, I would soon know where that open window was exactly. I could hear Leia thrashing about inside the sleeping bag. The thing had hold of the outside of it and was pulling her. I could hear the fabric tearing in long, ripping sounds as claws and teeth shredded through the outer shell. Parker was screaming from the couch. "What's happening?" And somewhere above us, through the ceiling, I heard the concussive thud of adult feet hitting the floor and running. The dragging reached the wall, and there was a different sound. The sleeping bag being hauled upward, lifted off the ground toward the slit window. The window frame groaned. Leia was screaming in short, breathless bursts, and I could hear the fabric of the sleeping bag catching at the edges of the window, tearing further. I understood, with a sick, lurching horror, that whatever had her was trying to pull her through that window, An 18-inch wide slit window 4 feet off the basement floor on the inside, but ground level on the outside. Something out there was hauling a child in a sleeping bag up the wall, attempting to drag her through it with the disturbing strength of something I don't want to share a world with. The basement light suddenly came on. Aunt Diane had hit the switch at the top of the stairs, and the bare bulb exploded the room back into existence. Every detail was harsh and yellow again, and suddenly, violently real. I saw the basement, the scattered sleeping bags and the crushed chip bag, the Ness still connected to the silent TV. Parker was now standing on top of the couch, his back against the wall. His face was white and his mouth was wide open. His hands were up near his chest like he was bracing for a hit. And across the room, against the far wall, there was Leia's sleeping bag, hanging. The top half was wedged into the open slit window, pulled upward and bunched into the narrow frame. The bottom half hung down the wall, limp, with Leia's weight inside it, sagging toward the floor. The bag was shredded in long lines, 4 slashes evenly spaced across, and through the tears I could see the color of Leia's pajamas and even the skin of her arm. She wasn't moving or screaming anymore. She had gone silent, so absolutely terrified she'd stopped moving. Then the bag dropped. Whatever had been holding it from outside released it all at once, and Leia and the sleeping bag collapsed to the basement floor in a heap. From outside the window, inches away, just on the other side of that ground-level slit, I heard something move, a single heavy thud, the sound of a large animal pushing off the grass, heading back for the tree line, leaving us there in the aftermath. Uncle Cal came down the stairs 3 at a time, his face aghast. He grabbed Leia off the floor, sleeping bag and all, and carried her rapidly up the stairs. Aunt Diane was behind him, one hand on the wall, the other over her mouth, asking questions. Parker scrambled off the couch and ran for the stairs. I saw him glancing at the still open window several times as he did. I was the last one up. As I reached the bottom step, I too turned and looked back at that window. It was still open, swinging slightly inward on its hinge. Beyond it, through the narrow rectangle of the opening, I could see a strip of the yard due to the light that spilled out from the basement. There was grass, the first few feet of ground outside, and at the edge of the light already pulling back into the dark, there was a pair of eyes. They were low to the ground and caught the basement light like an animal's, a yellow reflective shine. They were close together, but that's all I could see due to the dark. They looked at me for less than a second, but then they were gone, and I swear I could hear the sound of something moving fast through the woods. I ran up the stairs, and I didn't go back down. Leia was physically fine. There were some light scratches from the window frame on her arms and shoulders, a bruise across her ribs where she'd been pinned inside the sleeping bag as it was pulled against the narrow opening. But nothing was broken, nothing that would leave a scar on the outside. Uncle Cal went out with a flashlight, walking the perimeter of the house, while Aunt Diane sat with us in the living room with every light on. Uncle Cal came back about 15 minutes later, said he couldn't find a thing. He started to explain it. It was a bear, he said, attracted to the smell of the food we'd brought down there. And I could see in his face that he was constructing something that he could believe, not something that was currently true, but something that would become true. There was no more sleep to be had that night. We stayed up in the living room together until dawn, with the TV on and the volume up, every light on in the house. Leia sat in the corner of the couch with her knees pulled to her chest and did not speak. nor would she speak in the morning or the morning after that, and she would not talk to me or the rest of us for the remainder of that summer. Aunt Diane called the hospital that night. She was in the kitchen and she was keeping her voice low, but I was in the hallway and I heard most of it. She described what happened. She used the word animal several times and the word window several more. When she stopped, there was some silence, long enough that Aunt Diane said, "Mom, are you there?" But then my grandmother's voice came through, and I could hear what she asked. She had said, "Were the windows closed?" That was her first question. Not if Leia was okay, or what happened, but about the windows. It was like she knew exactly what would have happened if the windows were not locked, or if someone had gone down into the basement where the windows didn't lock. Grandma, like Grandpa, probably knew what was out there, but did not have the first-hand experience like Grandpa had. Grandpa would not have forgotten to lock the place down. But Grandma, in a panic, well, I can't blame her. This was not her fault. I really can't say it was anyone's fault. We were driven home 2 days later. Our summer was over. I hope that makes you understand why the sound of a box fan brings me some sort of comfort, or security might be a better word, because my mind has subconsciously associated things with that event. It knows that before the attack, there was box fan noise when we slept, but on the night of the attack, there was none. So until the day I die, there will be a box fan running full blast in my room, because I do not want to hear what's lurking outside my window. What in the world was that? What kind of creature resembles a thin and sickly werewolf, but can fit through a thin window to drag away children? This story is going to give me nightmares for weeks to come. Good night. Thank you all so much for joining me on my podcast here, called Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. You can listen to and review Unexplained Encounters on your favorite podcast app, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts and so on. It's super helpful. You can find all my narrations on YouTube at Darkness Prevails. Until next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.